In 1873, deep in the ruins of Nineveh, a British excavator named George Smith pulled a small clay tablet out of the earth. It was no larger than the palm of his hand. The cuneiform on its surface was so fine, so densely packed, that the scholars who examined it later assumed it was a fragment of an accounting record, a list of grain shipments, a tally of cattle, something dull, something administrative. It sat in the British Museum, uncatalogued, for almost a century. Then in 1962, a junior philologist working through the back rooms of the museum took a closer look. He noticed something the original translators had missed. The tablet was not a list of grain, it was a list of names. 6 names, 6 entities. And next to each name, the same recurring phrase, repeated like a refrain. The cuneiform sign, meaning before what was here now, before the people, before the cities, before the kings. The tablet was not an inventory of cattle. It was an inventory of beings that had walked the earth before us. The philologist's name was Eric Lundstrom. His notes were filed away and forgotten when he died of a stroke 3 years later. But the photographs he took of the tablet survived. They were rediscovered in 1998 by a researcher cataloging Lundstrom's archive. And what those photographs show is one of the most disturbing documents ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. The tablet lists 6 beings. 6. And after the 6th name, the cuneiform makes a turn that no one expected. A 7th sign. Not a name, a statement. The scribe had written, in language so plain it leaves no room for metaphor, that one of these 6 was still walking, still here, still among the people who would one day read these words. This is the story of the Sumerian tablet that lists 6 beings that were here before humans, and the one that is still here. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from the photographs, from the surviving fragments, from the cross-references in other Mesopotamian texts that historians have for centuries refused to take literally. By the end of this, you will understand why this tablet was never displayed, why Lundstrom's notes were buried, and why the 6th name on that list should make every person watching this look a little harder at the strangers around them. Before we open the tablet name by name, hit that subscribe button. This channel goes into the records that mainstream history has chosen to forget, and the algorithm only pushes this kind of work when people like you tell it to. Drop a like as well. It costs you nothing, and it puts this story in front of the next person who is ready to hear it. Now, let us look at the first name. To understand what we are about to read, you need to understand where this tablet came from and why almost no one in the academic world will talk about it openly. George Smith was not a man who exaggerated. He was a printer's apprentice who taught himself Akkadian in his spare time by visiting the British Museum on his lunch breaks. By the time he was 30, he had become the most respected cuneiform translator in Britain. He was the man who, in 1872, stood up in front of the Society of Biblical Archaeology and announced that he had found a Babylonian flood story that predated the book of Genesis by 1,000 years. He read the lines aloud, and the room went silent. Smith was sober, careful, and resistant to sensationalism. When he died of dysentery in Aleppo at the age of 36, having traveled to the desert to recover more tablets, he was already a legend in his field. What is not as widely known is that on his second expedition to Nineveh in 1873, Smith recovered a series of small fragments that he never published. He noted them in his field journal as the Dark Series. He did not explain in writing what he meant by that, but in a letter to his wife, dated April of that year, he wrote that some of the tablets he had recovered were of a nature that he was not yet prepared to translate in public. He said the contents were not appropriate for general readers. He said he would return to England and discuss them privately with the museum's senior staff. He did return. He showed the fragments to the keeper of antiquities. And then, according to the museum's own internal logs, the fragments were placed in a locked storage cabinet labeled simply M. Cabinet M would remain locked, more or less continuously, for the next 89 years. Eric Lundstrom was the man who finally opened it. Lundstrom was Swedish by birth, educated at Uppsala, and he had come to the British Museum in 1959 on a research fellowship that was supposed to last 2 years. He was studying the development of cuneiform sign forms across the late Sumerian and early Akkadian periods. It was the kind of dry, deeply technical work that almost no one outside his subfield would ever read. In the summer of 1962, Lundstrom was given permission to inventory the contents of several uncatalogued storage cabinets in the basement of the museum. Cabinet M was one of them. According to his own daily notes, which survive in the Lundstrom archive at Uppsala University, he opened the cabinet on the morning of the 14th of August, 1962. He counted 14 separate clay objects inside. Most of them were small fragments. 2 of them were intact tablets. One of those intact tablets, roughly the size of a deck of playing cards but flatter and slightly thicker, was covered on both sides with the densest cuneiform writing Lundstrom had ever seen. He began transcribing it that afternoon. By the end of the first week, he had realized that the tablet did not match any of the standard categories of Sumerian text. It was not an administrative document. It was not a hymn. It was not a king list, although it had certain features that resembled a king list. It was not a creation myth, although it referenced creation in passing. It was, as far as Lundstrom could tell, a kind of inventory. But what it inventoried was not goods or kings or gods. By the second week, Lundstrom had a working translation of the first section. He wrote in his notebook that the tablet appeared to be a record of beings who had inhabited the earth before the appearance of humans. He underlined the word humans 3 times. He was not a man given to underlining. Anyone who has read his other notebooks knows this. The triple underline meant that he understood in that moment that he had found something that did not fit into the academic framework he had spent his career building. Over the next 18 months, Lundstrom worked alone on the translation. He did not bring in colleagues. He did not ask for help with the difficult signs. According to his diary entries from that period, he did not trust the senior staff of the museum to handle the material responsibly. He believed, based on the condition of the cabinet and the way it had been organized, that previous keepers had known what was inside and had deliberately suppressed it. In April of 1965, Lundstrom completed his translation. He typed it up on his personal typewriter at his flat in Bloomsbury. He made 2 carbon copies. The original went into his desk. 1 copy went to a Swedish colleague at Uppsala. The other copy he intended to mail to the editor of an obscure journal of comparative mythology, where he believed it might be quietly published without attracting too much attention from the museum. He never mailed the 3rd copy. On the evening of the 2nd of June 1965, Lundstrom suffered a massive stroke in his flat. He was found by his cleaning lady the next morning. He died in hospital 3 days later without regaining consciousness. He was 47 years old. The original translation, the one in his desk, was packed up by museum staff along with the rest of his working papers and shipped back to Uppsala as part of the standard handling of a deceased researcher's estate. The Uppsala carbon copy was placed in storage with his other documents. The tablet itself, which Lundstrom had been keeping in his office under a special arrangement with the keeper of antiquities, was quietly returned to Cabinet M. For the next 33 years, no one read the translation. Lundstrom had no living children. His wife, who had been ill for some years, died in 1971. His papers were donated to the Uppsala University Library in 1972 and sat in an uncatalogued archival box. In 1998, a doctoral student named Mira Ahlgren, who was researching the history of Swedish philology in the post-war period, requested access to the Lundstrom archive as part of her dissertation. She opened the box, she found the translation. She also found the photographs, more than 200 of them, that Lundstrom had taken of the tablet during his 1.5 years of work on it. The photographs were clear, well-lit, and exhaustive. Every side of the tablet had been documented from multiple angles. Every individual sign was visible. Ahlgren was not herself a cuneiform specialist, but she read the translation, and then she read it again. And then she sat in the reading room of the Uppsala Library for the rest of the afternoon, holding the typed pages in her hands, trying to decide what to do. What she eventually did was photocopy the translation and the photographs, return the originals to the archive, and quietly distribute the copies to 3 independent researchers in 3 different countries who specialized in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. She asked them to evaluate Lundstrom's work without telling them where it came from or who had translated it. All 3 came back, within 6 months, with the same general assessment. The translation was technically competent. The signs Lundstrom had identified were correctly identified, with only a few minor disagreements over alternative readings. The grammar was consistent with late 3rd millennium Sumerian usage. The vocabulary, while unusual, was internally consistent. The tablet itself, judging from the photographs, appeared to be authentic. It was not a modern forgery. It had the wear patterns, the inclusion of small organic debris in the clay, and the typical breakage along the edges that one would expect from a tablet that had been buried for approximately 4,000 years. In other words, the document was real. The translation was sound, and what it said, when you read it in plain language, was not something that the academic establishment was prepared to accept. The official position of the British Museum, when contacted by one of the 3 researchers in 1999, was that no such tablet existed in their collection. When the researcher asked specifically about Cabinet M, the response was that no cabinet of that designation was currently in use. When the researcher asked whether the tablet might have been deaccessioned or transferred, the response was that the museum did not comment on internal collection management. When the researcher mentioned Lundstrom by name, there was no response at all. The tablet, in other words, had become officially invisible. But the photographs remained, the translation remained, and what they describe is the contents of a Sumerian record older than the city of Ur, older than the wheel, older than any document that has ever been admitted into the standard timeline of human civilization. The tablet begins with a single line of introduction. The line, in Lundstrom's translation, reads as follows. These are the 6 who were before, whose feet pressed the dust before the dust knew the foot of a man, whose voices spoke into the air before the air had heard the voice of a man, who are written here, so that those who come after may know that they came after. Then the tablet lists the 6, and it tells what each one did, and it tells what became of each one. And after the 6th, it does something that no other Sumerian tablet has ever been recorded doing. It addresses the reader directly. It speaks across the millennia to whoever might one day hold the tablet in their hands. And what it says, in that final line, is the reason this document has been kept out of public view for more than a century. We will get to that final line. But to understand it, we have to walk through the 6 first. We have to know who they were. We have to know what they did. And we have to understand why 5 of them are gone, and 1 of them is not. The first name on the tablet is rendered with 3 signs. Lundstrom spent the better part of a year settling on their reading. The signs are I, Gi, and Sha. The first sign, I, is the standard cuneiform for the eye, but used here as a determinative for sight or watching. The second sign, Gi, has multiple readings, but in this context it appears to mean enduring or continuing. The third sign, Sha, is a heart sign, used to indicate the inner part of a thing, the core, the binding center. Taken together, the name reads something like the Igigi Sha, the watching ones whose core endures, the elder watchers of the boundary. This is not the Igigi we know from the later Babylonian texts, the lesser gods who labored on the earth before the Anunnaki came down and took over the work. The Igigi Sha are older. They predate the Anunnaki. They predate, according to the tablet, every other being that would ever walk the world. The later Igigi, the ones we read about in the Atrahasis epic and elsewhere, would have called the Igigi Sha their elders. If elders is even the right word for beings that do not appear to have aged in the way we understand aging. The tablet's first column tells us what they were. They were the sky tenders, the keepers of the upper waters. According to the scribe, when the earth was still cooling, when the great deep had not yet been separated from the dry land, the Igigi Sha walked the boundary between the sky and the water. They were not gods in the religious sense. They were caretakers. They watched the slow turning of the heavens. They made sure that what was above remained above, and what was below remained below. In modern terms, you might say they were stewards of the planetary system. They oversaw the climate, they oversaw the magnetic field, they oversaw, if Lundstrom's reading is correct, the very rotation of the Earth. The tablet uses a phrase that translates roughly as, those who push the wheel of the days. It is a strange phrase. It implies that the rotation of the planet was not, in the time of the Igigi Sha, something that happened on its own. It was something that had to be tended, something that required attention, something that, if neglected, would slow and stop. The Igigi Sha were not solitary. The tablet says there were many of them. The exact number is given as the count of 7 sevens, which is to say 49. They worked in pairs and in larger groupings, depending on what the task required. Some of them tended the upper air. Some of them tended the slow drift of the polar ice. Some of them tended the great currents of the deep ocean. They moved between these stations with an ease that the tablet describes as the moving of breath inside a single body. They were not, the scribe insists, individual beings in the way that we are individual beings. They were aspects of a larger entity. The 49 were one being expressed in 49 forms. This is a difficult concept for the modern mind. We are accustomed to thinking of consciousness as locked inside a single skull. We are accustomed to thinking that a person is a person, and another person is another person, and the two of them are separated by the thin wall of their skin. The Igigi Sha did not work that way. According to the tablet, they shared one mind that was distributed across many bodies. They could see through each other's eyes. They could speak with each other's voices. When one of them learned something, all of them learned it. When one of them grew tired, all of them grew tired. Lundstrom noted in the margin of his translation that this sounded to him like a description of a hive intelligence. He wrote that the Igigi Sha resembled, in his understanding, the way that bees and ants are organized. He found this comparison disturbing. He wrote that the comparison troubled him because the cuneiform was clearly describing beings of high intelligence and clear individual purpose, not the simple, instinctive organization of an insect colony. He wrote that the closest modern concept he could find was the idea of a distributed consciousness, a single self that was running on many separate bodies in parallel. The tablet says the Agigisha were not made. They were not born. They did not come from somewhere else. They simply were. They were already on the Earth when the Earth itself was still a young thing, still cooling, still finding its shape. The tablet says they had been here longer than the mountains. They had watched the first mountains rise from the sea floor. They had watched the seas themselves form when the rain first fell from the cooling sky and gathered in the low places. This places the Agigisha, if we take the tablet at its word, somewhere in the deep geological past of the planet. We are talking about a being, or a network of beings, that was already operating on Earth before the continents had taken their current shape. We are talking about timescales that the modern academic mind has difficulty even contemplating. And yet the tablet is direct. The scribe writes that the Agigisha were here first, before everything that came after, and that they were responsible for making the world habitable for everything that would follow. What did they actually do, in the practical sense? The tablet gives us a partial answer. It describes a process the scribe calls the smoothing. The Agigisha smoothed the world. They took the harsh places and made them gentler. They took the wild swings of temperature and they evened them out. They took the violent storms that battered the early Earth and they tamed them into the orderly cycles of rain and wind that would later sustain plant life. They drew the carbon from the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years, and they laid it down in beds of stone, where it would not interfere with the breath of later creatures. They balanced the gases in the air. They calibrated the salt content of the oceans. They did, in short, the work of preparing a planet to host life. A modern reader might be tempted to dismiss this as poetic mythology, but notice something important. The tablet is not claiming that the Agigisha made the planet. It is not claiming that they created life. It is claiming, very specifically, that they prepared the conditions under which life could later emerge. They did the slow, patient geological work of terraforming. They were not creators. They were engineers, and they were patient. The tablet says their work took a span of time that the scribe describes as the count of 1,000 turnings of the year, 1 billion years. The Agigisha worked for roughly 1 billion years on the surface of the planet. They did not hurry. They did not rest. They tended the slow chemistry of the early Earth until it was ready to receive what would come next. What came next is where the tablet becomes interesting, because the Agigisha did not, according to the scribe, prepare the planet for humans. They did not even prepare it for any of the other 5 beings that the tablet will later describe. They prepared it for something else, something the tablet refers to only obliquely. The seed that was not yet planted. The arriving thing, the visitors who had not yet come. This is the first hint of a larger story that the tablet seems to know but does not fully explain. The Agigisha were terraforming the Earth for a specific purpose. They were preparing it for a specific arrival. And whatever it was they were expecting, it does not appear to have arrived in the way that they had planned. The tablet tells us, in a passage that Lundstrom marked as one of the most heavily damaged sections, that there was a long period of waiting. The Agigisha completed their work. The world was ready. The atmosphere was breathable. The oceans were the correct salinity. The temperature was stable. The land was firm. And then there was nothing. The arriving thing did not arrive. The visitors did not come. The seed was not planted. The Agigisha waited. The tablet says they waited for a length of time that the scribe could not name, only describe. A waiting longer than the work itself. A waiting longer than the smoothing had been. They waited so long that even their endurance, which had carried them through 1 billion years of patient labor, began to wear thin. And then, the tablet says, they made a decision. This is the first place where the tablet gives us a clear sense of the Agigisha as a being capable of choice. Up until this point in the narrative, they have been described as caretakers, as stewards, as a kind of automatic process running on the surface of the planet. But here, in the section that describes the long waiting, they become something else. They become a being that can decide. They look at the world they have prepared. They look at the absence of the thing that was supposed to come. And they decide that they will not wait any longer. What they did next is described in the tablet with a single, very compact phrase. They opened the way. The phrase uses cuneiform signs that have a specific meaning in the context of Sumerian religious literature. To open the way is to allow something to pass through. It is the same phrase used in later texts to describe the opening of the gates of the underworld, or the opening of the heavens for the descent of a god. It implies a deliberate act of unsealing something that had been sealed. What did they open? The tablet does not say directly, but it gives us enough context to understand. The Igigi Shah, having waited for the arriving thing that did not arrive, decided to bring it themselves. They opened a passage. They reached in some way that the scribe cannot describe in detail, into a place that was not the earth. And they brought through what came next. What came next was the second being. But there is something more to understand about the Igigi Shah. Because they are gone. The tablet is clear on this. After they opened the way and brought through what came next, they did something that the scribe describes as the folding. They folded themselves out of the world. They did not die in the way we would understand dying. They did not leave physical remains. They simply ceased to be present. The closest the tablet comes to explaining this is in a single line that reads, "When the work was done, they returned to the place from which they had not come." It is a strange line. It is grammatically odd in the original Sumerian. Lundstrom noted in his commentary that the verb forms used here suggest a motion that is also not a motion, a return that is also not a return. He speculated, very tentatively, that the line might be trying to describe a state of being that was simultaneously here and not here, present and absent, existing and unexisting. He admitted that this was a stretch, that the cuneiform may simply have been damaged in this section, that there might be a simpler reading that he was missing. But the implication, taken at face value, is that the Igigi Shah did not leave the way a physical being leaves. They did not travel to another place. They did not die. They unfolded out of the dimensional structure of the world. They went sideways, into a place that was always there, but that was not, and is not, part of the world we can see and touch. What this means for us, in practical terms, is that the Igigi Shah cannot be found. There are no fossils of them. There are no remains. There are no artifacts. The only trace they left, according to the tablet, is the world itself. The fact that the atmosphere is breathable, the fact that the oceans are the right salinity, the fact that the climate cycles in a way that supports life. These are not natural conditions. These are, according to the scribe, the lingering effects of 1 billion years of careful tending by beings who are no longer here to tend them. And here is something the tablet says, in a small marginal note that Lundstrom almost missed. The work of the Igigi Shah was not permanent. It was a setting. It was a calibration. It would hold for a long time, the scribe says, but not forever. Without the tenders, the calibration would slowly drift. The atmosphere would change. The oceans would shift. The wheel of the days would turn more slowly, or more quickly, or in some way that was different from how it had been set. The scribe does not give a timeline for this drift. The scribe simply notes that the absence of the tenders would, eventually, be felt. The world would, eventually, begin to come apart from the careful order that had been imposed on it. Some modern readers, when they reach this passage, find themselves thinking of climate change. They find themselves thinking of magnetic field weakening. They find themselves thinking of the strange and well-documented slowing of the Earth's rotation, which adds a leap second to our clocks every few years. They find themselves wondering whether the calibration is, in fact, beginning to drift. The tablet does not encourage this kind of speculation. The tablet simply records, in the matter-of-fact tone of an ancient scribe, that the first beings did their work, opened the way, and then folded themselves out of the world. The first beings are gone. The work they did remains, for now. And the second name on the tablet, the next of the 6, came through the opening that the Igigi Shah had made for it. The second name on the tablet is rendered with 2 signs that any first-year student of cuneiform would recognize. The signs are Ushum and Gal. The first sign, Ushum, is the standard Sumerian word for serpent, used throughout Mesopotamian literature for snakes, dragons, and the great composite reptilian beings that populate the older mythology. The second sign, Gal, simply means great or large. The compound name reads straightforwardly as the Great Serpents, the Ushumgal. This name is not unfamiliar to Mesopotamian scholarship. Versions of it appear in later texts. In some Sumerian compositions, Ushumgal is used as an epithet for kings, applied to rulers like Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh as a way of emphasizing their power and their ferocity. In other texts, Ushumgalu, the Akkadian form, refers to a specific class of dragon being, a serpent of cosmic scale, the kind of monster that the gods themselves had to fight in the early days of the world. The Babylonian Tiamat, the chaos dragon defeated by Marduk in the Enuma Elish, is sometimes called by this name. What the tablet does, with this second name, is anchor the Ushumgal in time. It places them before all of that, before the kings who would later borrow the name, before the dragons of Babylonian mythology, before Tiamat herself. The Ushumgal of the tablet are the originals. They are the source from which all the later serpent imagery in Mesopotamian thought eventually flowed. The tablet says the Ushumgal came through the opening that the Igigi Shah had made for them. They were the arriving thing. They were the seed that had finally been planted. The Igigisha had prepared the world for 1 billion years, waiting for a specific kind of life to come. What came was not what they had been waiting for, but it was what came. The Ushumgal were, according to the tablet, beings of the deep. Their natural medium was water. Not the warm, shallow seas of the surface, but the cold, dark trenches of the deepest ocean, where the pressure is crushing and the light has never reached. They could move through this environment as easily as a bird moves through air. Their bodies, the scribe says, were not bodies in the way that we understand bodies. They were long, sinuous, made of a substance that the tablet describes as being between flesh and stone. They could compress themselves to slip through narrow openings. They could extend themselves to enormous lengths when they hunted. They could change color, change shape, change the very density of their bodies depending on what they needed to do. The tablet says the largest of the Ushumgal were the size of mountains. The smallest were the size of a man. They lived in vast communities at the bottom of the early ocean. They built structures down there. The tablet describes these structures as cities, although the cuneiform sign for city is being used in a non-standard way here. Lundstrom noted in his commentary that the sign might more accurately be translated as gathering places or living complexes. These structures, the scribe says, were not made of stone or clay or any material that we would recognize. They were made of a kind of living material that the Ushumgal grew from their own bodies. They secreted it, they shaped it, they lived inside it. And when one of them died, its part of the city would slowly dissolve back into the water, leaving the rest of the city intact. The Ushumgal had a language. The tablet is very specific about this. They communicated with each other through a combination of sound, vibration, and chemical signaling in the water. Their language was complex enough to allow them to coordinate hunts, build their structures, and pass information between generations. The scribe says that the Ushumgal had songs. They had stories. They had what we would call culture, but they were not, according to the tablet, like us. Their minds did not work the way our minds work. They thought in long, slow rhythms. A single thought, for an Ushumgal, might take a year to complete. A single conversation might span decades. They did not experience time the way we experience it. They did not feel urgency. They did not feel haste. They moved through the world with a slowness that, to a human observer, would have seemed almost like stillness. This slowness was not weakness. The Ushumgal were, according to the tablet, extraordinarily powerful. They could shape the world around them. They could move great masses of water. They could, if they chose, raise islands from the seafloor or sink them again. They could create currents. They could create tides. They could, the scribe says, calm a storm or summon one simply by the coordinated thinking of a large enough number of them gathered together. The tablet does not tell us why the Igigisha brought the Ushumgal through the opening. It does not explain whether the Ushumgal were chosen or whether they were simply what happened to come through when the way was opened. There is a passage that some translators have read as suggesting that the Ushumgal came on their own, that they had been waiting in their own place for the way to be opened, and that they came through eagerly. Other translators, including Lundstrom in his final draft, have read the passage as suggesting that the Ushumgal were summoned, that the Igigisha specifically chose them, that they were the intended next step in some larger plan that the Igigisha had been working toward. Either way, the Ushumgal arrived. And the world they arrived into was, for them, very nearly perfect. The oceans had been prepared. The chemistry of the water had been calibrated. The temperature was right. The depths were deep enough to hold them. They moved into the seas of the early Earth, and they made it their home. They lived in the oceans, the tablet says, for an enormous span of time. The scribe gives a number that translates as the count of 100,000 years repeated 10,000 times. 1 billion years. The Ushumgal ruled the deep oceans for 1 billion years. During that time, they did not interfere with the surface of the world. They did not come up onto the land. They had no interest in the dry places. They were creatures of the dark and the cold and the pressure, and the surface was, to them, a hostile and uninteresting environment. The tablet describes their society in some detail. They were organized in what the scribe calls the Great Families. There were 7 of these families. Each family had its own territory in the deep ocean. Each family had its own variant of the Ushumgal language, its own customs, its own way of building. The families did not fight each other, but they did not mix either. They lived in parallel, occupying the same deep oceans but operating as separate civilizations. The leaders of each family were the oldest of their kind. The Ushumgal did not appear to age in the way we age. They simply grew larger and slower over time. The oldest of them, the ones who had been alive since the early days of their arrival, were the size of small islands. They lay in their gathering places, mostly motionless, communicating with the rest of their family through the slow vibrations of their bodies. They were called, in the tablet, the Deep Ones, who do not move. The young Ushumgal would visit them, would learn from them, would receive their wisdom and their long memories. The old ones held the history, the young ones carried it forward. There is a section of the tablet that describes a specific event in the history of the Ushumgal. It is, as far as we know, the only specific event from their billion-year tenure on Earth that the scribe chose to record. It is the event that the scribe identifies as the beginning of their end. The event is described as the rising of the heat. Something happened, the scribe says, in the deep ocean. The temperature began to rise. Not quickly, not catastrophically, but steadily. Year after year, the water grew warmer at the depths where the Ushumgal lived. The cold trenches that had been their home began to lose their chill. The Ushumgal noticed. Of course they did. They were tuned to the conditions of their environment, in a way that we cannot easily imagine. But because they thought so slowly, because their reactions unfolded over decades and centuries rather than over days and weeks, they did not respond quickly. They held counsel. They debated. They moved through their long, careful processes of collective decision-making. By the time they had agreed that something needed to be done, the warming had already advanced significantly. What was causing the warming? The tablet does not say in scientific terms, but it describes the cause in language that, if we read it carefully, becomes recognizable. The scribe says that the warming came from below. It came from inside the earth. It came from a stirring of the deep fires that the Igigi Shah had long ago calmed and quieted as part of their tending. What the scribe appears to be describing is a period of intense volcanic activity, a period when the molten interior of the earth began to push more heat through the crust than it had during the long stable era that the Igigi Shah had maintained. The deep oceans, which had been kept at a stable cold temperature by the Igigi Shah's careful calibration, began to warm because the heat from below was no longer being properly managed. This makes sense, in a way, if we accept the tablet's earlier claim that the Igigi Shah's work was a calibration that would drift over time once they were gone. The Ushumgal had inherited a perfectly calibrated planet, but the calibration was beginning to slip. The first sign of the slip was the slow warming of the deep ocean. The Ushumgal could not stop the warming. The tablet is explicit on this point. They tried. They organized. They used their collective power to attempt to cool the water, to redirect the currents, to push the heat back down into the crust. They failed. The warming was too deep, too fundamental, too connected to processes that operated on a scale even larger than they could manage, so they began to die. Not all at once. The Ushumgal were tough. They had been on Earth for 1 billion years. They did not give up easily. But the deep ocean, slowly and steadily, became uninhabitable for them. The pressure was wrong. The temperature was wrong. The chemistry of the water, which had supported them perfectly for so long, began to change. They retreated to the very deepest trenches, the few places where the cold still held. But those refuges grew smaller every century. The tablet says that the Ushumgal made a decision. It was a decision that the great families came to slowly, after long debate, but eventually they all agreed. They would not try to survive on the warming Earth. They would not adapt. They would not move to the surface. They would not become something other than what they were. Instead, they would go. Where they went is the most fascinating part of the Ushumgal story. The tablet says they went into the deep places. Not the deep places of the ocean. The deep places of the earth. The molten rivers beneath the crust. The hollow spaces that the scribe says exist in great numbers between the layers of the deep stone. The Ushumgal, having no other refuge, dove down through the seafloor and into the rock itself. They used their shape-changing abilities, their ability to compress and extend their bodies, their ability to alter their density, to move into places that no living creature should be able to enter. They went into the stone. They went into the molten heart of the planet. And there, the tablet says, they remained. They did not die. They did not all die, at any rate. Some of them survived the journey down. They found, in the hollow spaces beneath the crust, an environment that was different from anything they had known, but that was still survivable. The heat was tremendous, but they had grown accustomed to heat. The pressure was extraordinary, but they had always lived under pressure. The darkness was absolute, but they had always lived in darkness. The Ushumgal, according to the tablet, are not gone. They are below us. They live in the hollow places of the deep earth. They have been there for hundreds of millions of years. They are slow. They are old. They are still alive. This sounds, to a modern reader, like a fantasy, like something out of pulp fiction. The hollow earth, the subterranean civilization, the ancient race living beneath the surface. We have all read variations of this story. We have all seen it dismissed as nonsense by serious scientists. But the tablet does not present it as a fantasy. The tablet presents it as a record. The scribe is not telling us a myth. The scribe is telling us what happened. And the scribe is very specific about what happened. The Ushumgal went down. They did not come back. They are still there. They are no longer involved with the surface of the world. They are no longer interested in it. They are doing whatever it is that they do in the hot, dark spaces beneath the crust, and they have been doing it for a very long time. Are they, then, the one who is still here? Are the Ushumgal the answer to the tablet's final riddle? No. The tablet is clear on this. The Ushumgal are present, in a sense, but they are not here in the way that the final being is here. The Ushumgal are sealed below. They are inaccessible. They cannot interact with the surface world. They cannot affect us. They are, for practical purposes, in another world entirely. The tablet uses a phrase for them that translates as the buried ones. They are not gone, but they are not with us. The second being, then, is the Ushumgal, the great serpents. The deep beings who came through the opening that the Agigi Shah made, who ruled the oceans for 1 billion years, and who, when the world began to warm, dove down into the stone and sealed themselves into the hollow places of the earth, where they remain. The third name on the tablet is something else entirely, something that did not come from below or from the deep, something that came from above. And that is where the tablet's story begins to get strange. The third name on the tablet is rendered with 3 signs. The first is An, the standard Sumerian sign for sky or heaven. The second is Zu, which carries connotations of knowing or wisdom. The third is Kin, which has multiple meanings but here appears to be functioning as a collective marker, indicating a group or assembly. Lundstrom translated the compound as the Anzu Kin, the knowing sky ones, the skywise assembly. The name Anzu is familiar to anyone who has studied Mesopotamian mythology. The Anzu bird, also called Imdugud in older Sumerian texts, is a recurring figure. It is usually depicted as an enormous bird with the head of a lion, or sometimes the head of an eagle, with wings that span the heavens and a voice that shakes the mountains. In the myths, the Anzu bird is a thief and a troublemaker. It steals the tablet of destinies from the gods. It causes storms. It must be hunted down and defeated. In the most famous version of the story, the god Ninurta is sent to kill it. The Anzu kin of the tablet are not the same as the Anzu bird of the later myths, but they are related. They are, the tablet implies, the source from which the later Anzu imagery would eventually come. The scribe says that when humans much later began to tell stories about great winged beings in the sky, they were remembering, in distorted form, the Anzu kin who had come long before. The third name came, the tablet says, from above. The scribe is very specific about the direction. The Anzu kin descended from the upper air. They came down from a place that the tablet calls the high lattice. Lundstrom struggled with this term. The cuneiform signs are clear, but the concept they describe is not. The high lattice appears to be a structure of some kind, situated above the earth, made of something the scribe describes as light bound into shape. It is not the same as the sky. It is not the same as the stars. It is a separate thing, located between the world and whatever is beyond the world. The Anzu kin came from there. They had been there, the tablet says, for an unknown length of time. They had been waiting. They had been watching. And when the Ushumgal retreated into the earth, and the great seas grew quiet, the Anzu kin came down. What were they? The tablet describes them in terms that are simultaneously precise and impossible to fully visualize. They had bodies, but their bodies were not solid in the way that flesh is solid. The scribe says they were made of something that resembled clear water that did not flow. They were transparent. You could see through them, but they had shape. They had form. They had limbs, although the number and configuration of the limbs is described differently in different sections of the tablet, suggesting that the Anzu kin could change their form when they needed to. They had wings. The tablet is consistent on this. They had great wings of light, although the scribe is careful to note that the wings were not used for flying in the way that a bird uses its wings. The wings were used for something else. The scribe calls it the gathering. The Anzu kin would spread their wings and they would gather. What they gathered is not entirely clear. The tablet uses a term that translates as the upper substance. It seems to be something invisible, something that existed in the air around them, something that they could absorb through their wings and use as food, or as fuel, or as the material from which they built their thoughts. The Anzu kin were thinkers. This is what the tablet emphasizes about them above all else. They were intellectuals. They were investigators. They were the ones who, having come down to the surface of the prepared and now Ushumgal-free earth, set themselves the task of understanding the world. They built nothing. They did not construct cities like the Ushumgal had constructed in the deep ocean. They did not terraform like the Igigi Shah had terraformed. They did not change the world, they studied it. They moved across its surface in their transparent winged bodies, gathering data, asking questions, making maps. The tablet says they spent the early part of their tenure on the planet simply learning. They learned the mountains, they learned the rivers, they learned the plants and the animals that had begun to appear in the absence of the older beings. They learned the rocks, they learned the metals, they learned the way the air moved and the way the seasons changed. This was, in a sense, the first scientific civilization that had ever existed on Earth. The Igigi Shah had been engineers, not scientists. They tended what they had been given. They did not ask questions about it. The Ushumgal had been a kind of biological civilization, deeply integrated with their environment, but not abstract about it. They lived. They did not analyze. The Anzukin were the first beings on the planet to look at the world and ask why. And they were good at it. The tablet says that within a relatively short time, perhaps only a few thousand years, the Anzukin had developed an understanding of the world that was, in the scribe's words, deeper than the world itself. They understood things about the planet that the planet itself did not know. They understood how the air would behave under conditions that had never occurred. They understood how the rocks would change if the temperature shifted. They understood the patterns of the stars in a way that allowed them to predict, with absolute precision, what the night sky would look like 1,000,000 years in the future or 1,000,000 years in the past. The Anzukin were also, according to the tablet, the first beings on the planet to communicate with each other across great distances. The Igigi Shah had shared a distributed consciousness, but they were not really separate beings communicating. They were one being expressed across many forms. The Ushumgal had communicated through sound and chemistry, but only within their local environment. The Anzukin developed something new. They learned to send their thoughts across great distances, not through any physical medium, but through what the scribe calls the upper substance, the same material they gathered through their wings. They could speak to each other from opposite sides of the planet. They could share what they had learned in an instant. When one Anzukin observed something new, all of them knew about it within moments. They had built, in effect, the first telepathic network. Although the tablet does not use that word, the tablet describes it as the binding of thoughts. This made them, collectively, into a kind of distributed intelligence that resembled the Igigi Shah, but was structured differently. Where the Igigi Shah had been one being expressed as many, the Anzukin were many separate beings whose thoughts could combine into one. They could collaborate on problems that no single mind could solve. They could think together, in the way that a great orchestra plays together, with each individual contributing to a larger pattern. What did they do with this remarkable capability? The tablet's answer is, in some ways, disappointing. They did not build great works. They did not transform the world. They did not, as far as the scribe records, intervene in the affairs of any of the other living things that were beginning to appear on the earth at this time. They simply continued to learn. They continued to ask questions. They continued to gather knowledge. But there was a project. The tablet does mention a single great project that occupied the Anzukin for most of their tenure on Earth. The scribe calls it the writing of the world. The Anzukin were attempting to write down, in a complete and exhaustive way, everything that could be known about the planet they had come to. They were making a record. They were creating a kind of universal description of the Earth, a description so complete that, if the planet itself were ever destroyed, the description would be enough to recreate it from scratch. This was an enormous project. The tablet says it took the Anzukin most of their time on the planet. They worked at it for hundreds of millions of years. The record they were creating was not made of clay or stone or any physical material. It was made, the scribe says, of the same light-bound substance that the Anzukin themselves were made of. It was inscribed into the upper substance. It was woven into the high lattice. It was, in a sense, a description of the earth that was held in the same place where the Anzukin themselves had come from. The scribe suggests, although the tablet is damaged in this section, that the purpose of the record was not just preservation. It was communication. The Anzukin were creating the record for someone. Not for themselves, they already knew what was in it. The record was for whoever might one day need it. The scribe uses a phrase that translates as, for the readers who would come after, whoever those readers might be. This is one of the most intriguing passages on the tablet. It suggests that the Anzukin understood themselves to be participants in a larger sequence. They were not the final word. They were a middle term. They were doing their part of a longer story, and part of their part was to leave a record for whoever would come next. What happened to them? The tablet tells us. And it is, in some ways, the saddest of the 6 stories. The Anzukin did not die from any external cause. They were not killed. They were not attacked. They were not, as the Ushumgal had been, forced out by a changing environment. The Anzukin ended themselves. The tablet describes what happened with a quiet directness that is, in its way, more disturbing than any dramatic catastrophe. The Anzukin, the scribe says, completed their work. They finished the writing of the world. The record was done. And when the record was done, they had nothing left to do. This was a problem they had not anticipated. The Anzukin had been so deeply absorbed in their project that they had not considered what they would do when it was finished. They had not built a society. They had not built cities. They had not raised children. Although the tablet is not entirely clear on whether they reproduced at all, they had simply worked. And when the work was done, they found that they had no other purpose. The tablet says that they discussed this among themselves through their binding of thoughts for a very long time. They considered starting a new project. They considered trying to interact with the other forms of life that had begun to appear on the planet. They considered exploring beyond the Earth, going back up into the high lattice and from there into whatever lay beyond. But none of these options appealed to them. They were, the scribe says, a people who had been made for a single purpose, and they had completed that purpose, and they did not know how to begin again. So they made a collective decision. It was unanimous, the tablet says. There was no dissent. They had thought it through, all of them together, for as long as they needed to think. And when they had decided, they acted. They unmade themselves, not violently, not painfully. They simply released the bindings that held their forms together. Their bodies, made of clear water that did not flow, lost their cohesion. The wings of light dissolved. The transparent shapes faded into the upper air from which they had originally gathered themselves. The Anzukin chose to stop existing. This is a difficult passage to read. The scribe does not editorialize. The scribe simply records what happened. But the passage carries, even through the distance of 4,000 years and the dryness of cuneiform, a particular kind of weight. The Anzukin had been a magnificent civilization. They had been thinkers of the highest order. They had built a record of the earth so complete that it could have served as a template for recreating the world. And when their work was done, they decided that there was no longer any reason for them to exist. So they ended. There is, in a way, something dignified about this. The Anzukin did not cling to existence for its own sake. They did not become something other than what they had been. They did not degrade. They did not decline. They completed their work, and they ended. But there is also something terrible about it, because the record they made is, presumably, still there. It is held in the high lattice, in the same place from which the Anzukin originally came. It is waiting for the readers who would come after, and those readers, whoever they were supposed to be, have not yet come. Or perhaps they have come, and they cannot see the record because they do not know how to access the high lattice. Either way, the record is unread. The work the Anzukin gave their entire existence to producing sits, unviewed, in a place that no one currently on Earth knows how to reach. The tablet ends its account of the Anzukin with a single short line. The scribe writes, "They who knew the most knew themselves least," and ended. It is not clear whether the line is meant as a judgment, an observation, or simply a record. Lundstrom translated it without commentary. But anyone who reads it cannot help feeling that the scribe was, in this moment, allowing themselves a small moment of personal reflection on the fate of the third beings. So the Anzukin are gone. They are not buried like the Ushumgal. They are not folded out of the world like the Agigisha. They simply ceased. They unmade themselves. And what they left behind is a record, in a place we cannot reach, of the earth as it was during their time on it. The tablet now turns to the fourth name. And the fourth being is the one that, in some ways, is the most familiar to anyone who has read deeply into Mesopotamian literature, because the fourth being is the one the later Mesopotamians never quite stopped talking about. The fourth being is the one whose memory survived, in fragmented form, into the human era. The fourth being is the one we have, perhaps without knowing it, been telling stories about for thousands of years. The fourth name on the tablet is rendered with 3 signs as well: AB, Gal, and LU, or, in some readings, AP, KAL, and LU. The combination produces a word that is familiar to every scholar of ancient Mesopotamia, the Apkallu. The tablet adds a final sign, SU, which means flesh or body, and which here appears to be functioning as a modifier. The full name is the Apkallu Su, the bodied Apkallu, the Apkallu who had form. Anyone who has studied the religious literature of ancient Iraq has encountered the Apkallu. They appear in the Babylonian creation accounts. They appear in the surviving fragments of Berossus, the 3rd century priest who wrote a history of Babylon for the Greek-speaking world. They appear in the protective figurines that Mesopotamian homeowners buried under the floors of their houses to keep evil out. They are the 7 sages. They are the bringers of civilization. They are the half-fish, half-human beings who emerge from the sea to teach humanity the arts of writing, of building, of agriculture, of law. In the standard mythology, there are 7 Apkallu. They come, one at a time, from the deep waters. The first and most famous is Oannes, who, according to Berossus, came out of the Persian Gulf at dawn and taught the people of the early cities everything they needed to know about civilization, then returned to the sea at sunset. The next day, he came back, and the next. He continued this teaching for many years. And when his work was done, 6 more Apkallu followed him, each contributing their own piece to the great project of educating humanity. This is the story we have inherited. This is what the tablets that have been publicly translated have told us about the Apkallu. The tablet in Cabinet M tells us something different. It tells us that the Apkallu Su, the bodied Apkallu, were not 7 beings. They were a population, a people, a civilization. There were thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands, perhaps more. They lived in the seas that the Ushumgal had left behind when the deep ones went down into the earth. The Apkallu Su were not, like the Ushumgal, creatures of the cold deep. They lived in the warmer, shallower waters, the coastal seas, the great river mouths, the brackish marshes where fresh water met salt. They were creatures of the boundary between water and land. Their bodies, the tablet says, were genuinely amphibious. They could breathe in water. They could breathe in air. They had 2 forms, depending on which environment they were in. In the water, they were sleek, fish-shaped, with smooth scales and powerful tails and webbed hands and feet. On land, the scales would lighten and partially recede, the tail would fold against the body, and the webs between their fingers and toes would tighten and become less prominent. They could walk on land for hours at a time before they needed to return to the water. They could swim in the sea for days or weeks before they needed to come up. The Apkallu Su, the tablet says, were the first beings to choose to interact with the surface world in a sustained way. The Agigi Shah had tended the surface from a kind of distributed perspective that did not really involve walking on it. The Ushumgal had ignored it. The Anzukin had studied it from above but had not built anything on it. The Apkallu Su lived on it. They built on it. They moved across it, and they made it part of their home, but not their only home. They retained their connection to the water. They built their cities in the great marshes and along the river deltas, where the boundary between sea and land was blurred. They constructed buildings of stone, although the tablet says they also used other materials that we do not have direct evidence for. They built canals. They built docks. They built walls. They built towers. They built libraries. Their civilization, the tablet says, was old, older than anything we would consider civilization. It lasted, in some form, for a span that the scribe gives as the count of 30,000 years. 30 million years. The Apkallu Su had been building and rebuilding their cities on the coastlines of the early Earth for 30 million years before the first humans appeared. This is a number that breaks the mind. We are accustomed to thinking of human civilization as something that began in the past few thousand years. We are accustomed to thinking that any earlier civilizations, if they existed at all, would have left clear traces. But the Apkallu Su, according to the tablet, built their cities in places that no longer exist. The coastlines they built on are now buried under hundreds of feet of sediment. The marshes they lived in have long since dried and turned to desert or been flooded by the rising seas. Whatever ruins they left have been ground down by glaciers, drowned by oceans, buried by mountains. We are not in a position to find their cities because their cities were never in the places we would think to look. What kind of civilization did they build? The tablet gives us a detailed answer. They built a civilization of knowledge. They were, like the Anzukin before them, intensely interested in understanding the world. But they were more practical about it than the Anzukin had been. The Apkallu Su did not just study the world. They worked with it. They cultivated. They crossbred. They selected. They modified. The tablet says that many of the plants and animals that exist on Earth today were, in some way, influenced or shaped by the Apkallu Su during their long tenure. They worked with the early grasses and helped them become the cereal grains that would later feed human civilizations. They worked with the early fruit-bearing trees. They worked with the wild ancestors of cattle, of sheep, of dogs. They were not creating life from scratch. The Agigi Shah had not given them that capability, and the tablet is clear that they never claimed it, but they were shaping life. They were guiding its development. They were, over the course of 30 million years, slowly preparing the biological world for whatever was supposed to come next. The Apkallu, like the Anzu-kin before them, appear to have understood themselves as participants in a longer sequence. They knew they were not the final inhabitants of the earth. They knew something would come after them, and they were deliberately and patiently preparing the world for whatever those next inhabitants would be. They were also, the tablet says, the first beings to write. The Anzu-kin had made a record, but it was held in the upper substance, not in any physical material. The Apkallu invented writing in the sense that we would recognize. They marked symbols on stone, they marked symbols on clay. They developed a system of recording information that could be passed down through generations without the need for direct memory or oral tradition. This system, the scribe of the tablet says, was the ancestor of cuneiform itself. The script that the scribe was writing in had been invented, in its earliest form, by the Apkallu millions of years before the first human ever held a stylus. This is, perhaps, the most provocative claim on the entire tablet. It suggests that the writing system the scribe was using to record the tablet, the very technology that had enabled the tablet to be created in the first place, was an inheritance from a non-human civilization that had been on Earth for 30 million years before us. The scribe was, in a sense, writing in a language that had not originally been a human language at all. The Apkallu, the tablet says, were aware of the limited time they would have. They knew somehow that their civilization would not last forever. They knew that something would come after them, and they decided, as their tenure on Earth grew long, that they would deliberately leave behind tools that the next beings could use. They would not let everything they had learned be lost. They would seed the next civilization with what they had built. They began this seeding process millions of years before the end of their civilization. They left writing systems, partially complete, in places where the next beings could find them and continue developing them. They left agricultural techniques, scaled down for smaller hands and shorter lives. They left certain practical sciences, including basic mathematics and astronomy, encoded into structures and patterns that could be rediscovered by anyone capable of careful observation. They were, in a sense, designing a curriculum for whoever would come after them. This is where the tablet connects most directly with the standard mythology of the Apkallu. The 7 sages who, according to Berossus, came out of the sea to teach the early humans were not 7 separate beings. They were the surviving population of the Apkallu in the very last phase of their existence, making one final effort to transfer their knowledge to the new beings that had appeared on the earth. The story of Oannes coming out of the Gulf at dawn to teach the people of Eridu is a memory of this final teaching. The number 7 is symbolic. The actual interactions involved many Apkallu over many years, working with the earliest human communities to give them the tools they would need to build civilizations of their own. But that was the end. By the time the Apkallu were teaching humans how to write, and how to farm, and how to build, they were already in decline. Their numbers had been dropping for millions of years. The climate of the earth was shifting. The marshes were drying. The coastlines were changing in ways that made their amphibious lifestyle increasingly difficult. The carefully calibrated environment that the Ijigi-Shah had once maintained was, slowly but unmistakably, falling out of calibration. What killed the Apkallu was not a single catastrophe. It was the slow accumulation of small failures. The marshes they depended on for breeding shrank, century by century. The river deltas where they built their cities became unstable, with the rivers shifting their courses unpredictably. The temperature swings between seasons grew more extreme. The Apkallu, who had been perfectly adapted to a specific kind of stable boundary environment, found themselves living in a world where that environment was disappearing. They did not die out all at once. They did not have a final extinction event. They simply became fewer and fewer and fewer. The cities shrank. The libraries closed. The great projects of cultivation and shaping were abandoned. The teaching of the new beings, the early humans, became their last activity, their final purpose, the thing they did when there was no longer anything else they could do. And then they were gone. The tablet says that the last of the Apkallu returned to the sea, not in any grand or dramatic way. They simply walked back into the water, one at a time, over the course of many generations, until there were no more of them on the land. Some of them, the scribe says, may still survive in the deep water, in small numbers, in places where the conditions are still tolerable for them. But they are no longer a civilization. They are not a people. They are, at most, a scattered remnant of a population that once shaped the entire surface of the world. The scribe of the tablet ends the section on the Apkallu with a phrase that has been the subject of much debate among the few people who have read the translation. The phrase is, "They made us. and they made the way we make. Lundstrom translated it cautiously. He noted that the verb to make, in Sumerian, has multiple shades of meaning. It can mean to create. It can mean to shape. It can mean to teach. It can mean to enable. The scribe might be saying that the Apkallu literally created humanity. Or the scribe might be saying that the Apkallu taught humanity how to be human, how to live as a civilized people, how to do the things that humans do. The Sumerian does not distinguish clearly between these meanings. What is clear is that the scribe felt a deep connection to the Apkallu. The fourth section of the tablet is, in tone, more reverent than the previous three. The Agigisha are treated as distant and almost incomprehensible. The Ushumgal are treated as alien and lost. The Anzukin are treated with respect but also with a hint of pity. The Apkallu are treated by the scribe as ancestors, as teachers, as beings whose memory the scribe felt a duty to preserve. This makes sense in a way. If the tablet is telling the truth, then the Apkallu were the beings who had the most direct influence on the development of human civilization. They were the ones who taught the first humans how to write, how to farm, how to build, how to organize. They were, in a literal sense, the ancestors of every aspect of human culture. And the scribe, writing the tablet in some early Sumerian city, was operating in a tradition that had been handed down, generation after generation, all the way back to the Apkallu themselves. But the Apkallu are also gone. They are not coming back. They are scattered. They are forgotten. They survive only in the half-remembered myths of the seven sages and in the cuneiform writing system that the scribe was using to record this very tablet. The fourth being is, like the three before it, in the past tense. The fifth name on the tablet now follows, and the fifth being is, in some ways, the most disturbing of the first five, because the fifth being was not a civilization. The fifth being was not a peaceful population doing patient work. The fifth being was something else. The fifth name on the tablet is rendered with three signs, LAH, MU, and KUR. The first sign, LAH, carries connotations of hair, of roughness, of the wild. It is the same sign that appears in the later word Lamu, which Mesopotamian texts use for various hairy or shaggy beings, including a class of protective spirits often depicted as bearded men. The second sign, MU, is a versatile sign with many meanings. Here it appears to be functioning as a personalizer, indicating that the LAH quality belongs to the being described. The third sign, KUR, is the standard Sumerian word for mountain, but also for foreign land, for the high places, for the wild country beyond the cities. The compound name reads as the Lamu-Kur, the hairy mountain ones, the wild ones of the high places. The fifth being came, the tablet says, while the Apkallu were still in their long middle period, still active and powerful in their coastal cities. The Lamu-Kur did not come from above, like the Anzukin. They did not come through any opening, like the Ushumgal. They emerged. They came up out of the wild country itself. They were, the scribe says, born of the mountains. This is a different kind of origin from any of the previous four. The Agigisha simply were. The Ushumgal arrived through an opening. The Anzukin descended from the high lattice. The Apkallu came out of the sea. But the Lamu-Kur, according to the tablet, were generated by the earth itself. They emerged from caves. They climbed out of deep crevices in the rock. They walked out of forests where no being had walked before. They appeared, in a way that no observer at the time could fully explain, in the high, cold places of the world. What they were, in physical terms, was something the tablet describes in vivid detail. They were enormous. The smallest of them stood 3 times the height of a man. The largest of them stood 7 times the height of a man, or even more. They were covered in thick, coarse hair, dark in color, that protected them from the cold of the mountains where they lived. They had powerful arms that could tear stone from the cliff face. They had broad chests and deep voices. Their faces were heavy and brow-ridged. Their eyes, the scribe says, were small and dark and very intelligent. The Lamu-Kur were not, like some of the previous beings, made of any strange substance. They were flesh and blood and bone. They were biological. They were, in a way that none of the earlier beings had been, fully a part of the natural world of the earth. They ate, they drank, they slept, they bled when they were cut. They could be killed. But they were also not like any biological being that the earth had seen before. They were enormously strong. They were extremely long-lived. The tablet gives the lifespan of a Lamu-Kur as the count of 700 years. They reached maturity slowly, over the course of about a century, and they remained in their prime for many centuries before age began to slow them. A single Lamu-Kur, born into the world, would walk the mountains for 700 years before dying. They were intelligent. The tablet emphasizes this. They were not animals. They had language. They had names for themselves and for each other. They had a complex social structure. They had what we would recognize as religion, although the tablet describes their religion in a way that is hard to fully understand. They believed, the scribe says, that they were children of the stone, that the mountains had birthed them, and that when they died, they would return to the mountains. They worshipped in some sense the deep places, the caves, the crevices, the dark hollows from which their ancestors had first emerged. The Lamu-Kur lived in groups. The scribe calls these groups the clans, although the cuneiform sign suggests something more specific than a simple human-style family unit. Each clan had its own territory, usually a particular mountain or range of mountains. The clan would defend its territory fiercely against any intruder, including other Lamu-Kur from other clans. They were, the scribe says, deeply territorial. They did not like to share. They did not form alliances with other clans, except in the most extreme circumstances. This was, in some ways, the great limitation of the Lamu-Kur. They had the strength to break stone, the intelligence to plan, and the years to remember what their grandparents had done. But they were also deeply tribal, deeply isolated, deeply suspicious of any being that was not part of their immediate clan. They never built a civilization in the sense that the Apkallu had built a civilization. They never wrote. They never gathered in large enough numbers to develop the kinds of cooperative projects that the previous beings had been capable of. They lived as small bands, scattered across the high places of the world, each band knowing little of the others and caring even less. They did, however, build things. Not cities, but smaller works. They built shelters in the caves where they lived. They carved patterns into stone walls. They worked metal, in a limited way, hammering copper and gold and iron into rough tools and rough ornaments. They made weapons. They made spears tipped with sharpened stone. They made clubs of heavy wood reinforced with bone. They made when they needed to fire. What the Lamu-Kur were good at, above all, was hunting. They were the great hunters of the ancient world. They could track any animal across any terrain. They could move silently despite their enormous size. They could bring down prey that no other being could have hunted. They lived primarily on the meat of large animals. They hunted the great cave bears. They hunted the giant deer of the early forests. They hunted, the tablet says, beings that the scribe cannot find names for in Sumerian, because those beings had been extinct for so long by the time the scribe was writing that no human had ever seen one. The Lamu-Kur were also, occasionally, hunted. This is something the tablet treats with particular interest. There were predators, in the world of the Lamu-Kur, that could threaten them. Great cats, larger than any cat alive today, that hunted in coordinated groups. Bird-like creatures of enormous size, descendants perhaps of some line of fauna that had evolved in the long centuries after the Anzukin departed. And, the tablet says, certain other beings the scribe does not name. Beings that lived in the deep forests and that emerged occasionally to take a Lamu-Kur child or even an isolated adult. These unnamed beings appear several times in the section on the Lamu-Kur. The scribe seems to know what they are, but does not want to describe them in detail. They are referred to obliquely. They are called the shadow takers. They are called the ones who watch from the trees. They are called the followers. The Lamu-Kur, despite their strength, were afraid of them. The Lamu-Kur built their shelters with thick walls and small openings, partly to keep these followers out. We will return to this, because the followers are not the Lamu-Kur. The followers are something else. And the tablet, in its careful way, is dropping hints about them throughout the 5th section, even as it focuses on the Lamu-Kur themselves. How long did the Lamu-Kur last? The tablet gives their tenure as the count of 100,000 years. 100 million years. The Lamu-Kur walked the mountains of the earth for 100 million years. They were not a brief presence. They were a sustained, ancient, deeply rooted population that occupied the high places of every continent for a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of mammals as we currently understand it. What ended them was, like the Apkallu, not a single catastrophe. The Lamu-Kur faded out in a long, slow decline that took millions of years to complete. The climate of the earth was changing. The great forests where they had hunted were retreating, replaced by drier grasslands where their massive bodies were poorly suited. The cold of the highest mountains, where they had always taken refuge, became deeper and harsher as the great ice ages began their long sequence. The animals they hunted began to disappear, replaced by smaller, faster, harder-to-catch creatures that the Lamu-Kur could not easily run down. Their numbers dropped. Clan after clan died out. The territories they had defended for millions of years grew empty. The shelters they had built in their caves were abandoned, and the wind blew the dust over their fires, and the rains washed away their carved patterns from the stone walls. By the time humans began to appear in any significant numbers, the Lamukir were already a scattered, diminished population, clinging to the most remote mountain ranges of the world. There were encounters. The tablet mentions these in passing. Early human bands, the first true humans, occasionally encountered surviving Lamukir in the mountains. The encounters were not, generally, friendly. The Lamukir by this point were old and wary and deeply distrustful of anything that moved through their territory. The humans, for their part, were terrified of the great hairy giants who appeared out of the mist on the high passes. There were fights. There were ambushes. The humans, in time, learned to avoid the territories where the last Lamukir lived. The Lamukir, for their part, retreated even further, into the highest and coldest and most inaccessible places. The tablet says that some of the very last Lamukir may have survived into the time of the first cities. The scribe writes that, even within memory of the elders of the scribe's own city, there were travelers who claimed to have seen them in the high mountains to the east. The descriptions in those traveler accounts match, the scribe says, the descriptions in the older records of the Lamukir. But these were rare sightings, isolated encounters, the final fading echoes of a population that had once spanned the world. Are there any of them left? The tablet, perhaps surprisingly, gives a tentative answer. The scribe says in a small note at the end of the 5th section that it is possible that a very few of the Lamukir still exist, in the very deepest and most remote mountains of the earth. The scribe says that they would now be very old, even by Lamukir standards, perhaps the last few individuals from clans that died out generations ago. They would be solitary, they would be reclusive. They would have learned, over a long lifetime of being hunted by humans and pushed further and further into hiding, to be invisible. But these last few, if they exist, are not the answer to the tablet's final riddle. They are not the one who is still here. They are a fading remnant. They are, at most, a handful of individuals clinging to existence in places where humans almost never go. The Lamukir as a being, as a population, as a presence on the earth, is finished. The scribe ends the 5th section with a phrase that is, in its way, an elegy. The phrase translates as, "The great walkers of the high places, who knew the stone before the stone knew them, are returning to the stone." Most of them have returned already. The few who have not are walking the last paths. Their footprints in the snow are growing fewer with each generation. This is the 5th being, the Lamukir, the hairy giants of the mountains. They are very nearly gone. And now, finally, the tablet turns to the 6th name, the 6th being, the one whose story the entire tablet has been, in a sense, leading us toward. The one whose presence is the reason this document was placed in Cabinet M, and locked, and forgotten for almost a century. The 6th name on the tablet is the one that the scribe was most reluctant to write down, and the one that, having written it, the scribe felt compelled to tell us about more fully than any of the other 5. Because the 6th name is not in the past tense. The 6th name on the tablet is rendered with 3 signs, she, du, and hal. The first sign, she, is most often used in cuneiform as a designation for grain, but in older Sumerian usage, it can also carry the meaning of a quiet thing, a small thing, a thing that does not draw attention to itself. The second sign, du, has a range of meanings related to going, walking, moving. The third sign, hal, is the standard sign for hiding, for concealment, for that which is covered and cannot be seen. The compound name Shedu-hal reads as the quiet walking hidden ones, the ones who move unseen. This is not, despite the similarity in spelling, the same as the Shedu of later Babylonian and Assyrian religion. In the later periods, the Shedu became a protective spirit, a guardian figure depicted as a winged bull with a human face, set at the gates of palaces and temples to ward off evil. The Shedu-hal of the tablet are something different. They are older. They are stranger. And they are not, the scribe insists, friendly. The Shedu-hal came before the Lamukir. The tablet is careful about the chronology here. Although the Shedu-hal are the 6th name on the list, they are not the most recent of the beings. They came, in fact, very early in the sequence. They came shortly after the Anzu-kin had finished their writing and unmade themselves. They came while the Apkallu-Su were still in the early phase of building their coastal civilization. The Shedu-hal have been on Earth for, by the tablet's reckoning, nearly all of the time that the surface has been inhabited by anything resembling intelligent life. Where did they come from? The tablet, unusually, does not say. It says only that they appeared. It does not describe an opening through which they came, like the Ushumgal. It does not describe a descent from above, like the Anzu-kin. It does not describe an emergence from the sea or the earth. like the Apkallu or the Lamu Kur. The Sheduhal simply began to exist. One generation, they were not present. The next generation, they were. The scribe says that this absence of an origin story is itself one of the strangest things about them. They are the only one of the 6 beings whose first appearance on the earth cannot be traced. What were they, physically? Here the tablet becomes both detailed and difficult. The Sheduhal had bodies. They were biological in some sense. They could be touched. They could be wounded. They could be killed. They were not made of light, like the Anzu-kin. They were not made of the strange flesh-stone substance of the Ushumgal. They were not made of clear water that did not flow. They were made of something the scribe calls the changing flesh. The Sheduhal could change their bodies. This is the central, defining feature of what they were. They were not stuck in a single form, the way the Ushumgal were stuck or the Lamu Kur were stuck. They could shift. They could shape their flesh into different configurations. Not instantly, the tablet is clear about that. The change took time. A full transformation from one form to another might take a Sheduhal several hours, or even several days. But given enough time, a Sheduhal could look like almost anything. What did they actually look like in their default form when they were not actively changing? The tablet provides a description, and it is one of the more unsettling passages in the entire document. The scribe writes that the natural form of a Sheduhal, the form they took when they were not deliberately shaping themselves into something else, was approximately the size and proportions of a human. They had 2 legs, they had 2 arms, they had a head with 2 eyes, a mouth, the standard configuration. They were not, in their natural form, monstrous in shape. They were, in fact, deeply ordinary in shape. But they were not exactly human. The scribe is very specific about the differences. The skin of a Sheduhal, in its natural form, was pale, almost translucent. The eyes were larger than human eyes, and the pupils were vertical, like the pupils of a cat or a snake. The fingers were slightly longer than human fingers, with 1 extra joint. The teeth, when the mouth was open, were sharp throughout, not just the canines. There was no body hair to speak of. The voice, when they spoke, was low and quiet and had a slight rasp to it. In their natural form, they were recognizable as not human. Anyone who looked closely at one would notice the differences immediately. The eyes alone would give it away. But the Sheduhal almost never appeared in their natural form. The whole purpose of being able to change their flesh was to avoid being seen as what they were. They lived, the tablet says, by appearing as something else. They learned the shapes of other beings. They watched the other inhabitants of the world. They studied. They practiced. They became expert in mimicry. In the early days, when the Apkallu were the dominant civilization on the planet, the Sheduhal would appear among them looking like Apkallu. Not perfectly. The mimicry was good, but not flawless. There were always small things wrong. A movement that was slightly off. A way of speaking that was almost right, but not quite. The Apkallu, with their long memories and their careful attention to detail, sometimes noticed. When they noticed, they would exile the Sheduhal from their cities. They never killed them, the tablet says. They never could quite bring themselves to. They would simply ask the suspected Sheduhal to leave, and the Sheduhal would leave. Later, when the Lamu Kur were the dominant population in the wild places, the Sheduhal would appear in Lamu Kur form. This was a more challenging mimicry, given the size and the hair and the brow ridges, but the Sheduhal could manage it for short periods, especially in poor light. They would slip into the edges of a clan's territory. They would observe. They would occasionally take something. A child, an isolated hunter, a wounded individual who had been left behind. The Lamu Kur knew the Sheduhal were among them, in some form. They could not always identify them. They feared them. They called them the followers. They built their shelters with thick walls, partly to keep them out. This is the connection back to the earlier passage. The followers that the Lamu Kur feared in their high mountain territories were the Sheduhal. They had been there. They had been hunting the Lamu Kur. They had been part of the long decline of the giants, taking individual after individual, generation after generation, contributing to the slow extinction. The Sheduhal, the tablet says, did not need to eat in the way that other beings ate. They did not need food in the conventional sense. What they consumed, what they actually lived on, was something the scribe calls the inside life, the vital energy, the animating force. They took it from other living beings. They drained it. They could do this by touch, the tablet says, or they could do it from a distance if they concentrated. The being from which the inside life was taken did not always die. Sometimes the loss was small enough that the victim survived, perhaps a little weaker, perhaps a little duller in the eyes. But sometimes the Sheduhal needed more, and then the victim would die. And the Sheduhal would feed on the death itself, on the last bright burst of life leaving the body, on the closing of the great window between living and not living. This is what they were. They were predators. They were patient, intelligent, shape-changing predators that had appeared on the earth in the time of the Apkallusu, that had survived all the changes the world had gone through since, and that had fed on every other intelligent being that had existed on the earth since their arrival. There were never very many of them. The tablet is clear on this. The Sheduhal were not, like the Apkallusu, a great population. They were not, like the Lamu-Kur, scattered across the world in many clans. They were always few. The scribe gives an estimate of their total numbers at the time the tablet was being written. The estimate is the count of 700. 700 Sheduhal in the entire world. A small population, even for an apex predator. But they did not need to be many. They needed only to be hidden. And they were very, very good at being hidden. When the early humans began to appear, the Sheduhal noticed. They had noticed every previous arrival on the earth. They had adapted their mimicry to each new dominant species in turn. When humans began to outnumber the Lamu-Kur, when humans began to build small settlements, when humans began to organize themselves into the first communities, the Sheduhal turned their attention to humans. They began to learn how to be human. This was, in some ways, the easiest mimicry the Sheduhal had ever attempted. Humans were small, like them. Humans had the same basic proportions, the same number of limbs, the same arrangement of features. The differences between a Sheduhal in its natural form and a human were small enough that, with practice, they could be hidden entirely. The vertical pupils could be made to appear round. The long fingers could be folded slightly to hide the extra joint. The sharp teeth could be kept behind closed lips. The pale, translucent skin could be tanned and roughened to match the appearance of a human who had lived in the sun. The Sheduhal moved among the early human communities. They lived in the early villages. They took human names. They learned human languages. They learned human customs. They were not, the tablet emphasizes, distinguishable from humans on casual inspection. A Sheduhal could live in a small village for years, marry into a human family, raise children, grow old, and die, and never be recognized for what it was. The children. This is one of the most disturbing parts of the sixth section. The Sheduhal could have children with humans. The offspring were, the tablet says, not quite either thing. They were not full humans. They were not full Sheduhal. They were something in between. Some of them inherited the shape-changing ability, to a partial degree. Some of them inherited the long lifespan that the Sheduhal possessed, although in a diminished form. Some of them inherited the hunger for the inside life of others. The hybrid offspring of Sheduhal and humans, the scribe says, walk among us still. They have for thousands of years. The Sheduhal blood, once introduced into the human population, never fully disappears. It thins, it dilutes, but it does not go away. This raises a question that the tablet does not fully answer. How many people walking the earth today carry, somewhere in their distant ancestry, the bloodline of the Sheduhal? The scribe does not give a number. The scribe says only that the contamination, if that is the right word, is widespread. The Sheduhal have been breeding with humans for at least the last 20,000 years. The offspring have been breeding with other humans. The bloodline has spread across continents. It is, the scribe says, very nearly everywhere. But the pure Sheduhal, the tablet says, are still here as well, not just their hybrid descendants. The actual pure-blooded beings, the original shape-changers, are still walking the earth. They are very old by now. A pure Sheduhal, the scribe says, can live for many thousands of years. They do not die of age in any way that we can recognize. They die only by violence, or by accident, or occasionally by something the tablet refers to as the choosing, which appears to be a form of voluntary ending similar to what the Anzu-kin did, but performed individually rather than as a population. The pure Sheduhal who exist today, the tablet says, were already old when the first Sumerian cities were being built. Some of them remember the time of the Lamu-Kur. Some of them, the very oldest, may even remember the late Apkallusu. They have walked this earth, in their changing forms, for so long that the entire history of human civilization is, to them, a recent development. They were here before us. They will be here after us. And they are here now. How would you know if one of them was near you? The tablet provides some guidance on this. The scribe says that the Sheduhal, no matter how perfect their mimicry, cannot fully hide certain things. They cannot hide what they need. They need to feed. They need to take the inside life from other beings. And the act of taking, even when it is done carefully, leaves traces. A Sheduhal who has fed recently, the tablet says, has a particular quality about them. The eyes are too bright. The skin has a certain glow. a certain plumpness that is not quite natural. The voice is stronger. The movements are quicker. After a feeding, the Sheduhal feels alive in a way that is, to a careful observer, slightly excessive. There is too much life in them. The vitality is wrong. It does not match the body. A Sheduhal who has not fed recently, on the other hand, looks the opposite. The eyes are dull. The skin is gray and slack. The voice is weak. The movements are slow. They appear to be drained, exhausted, not quite well. They will be irritable. They will be hungry. They will be looking for something to feed on, and the people around them. This is the part the tablet emphasizes most. The people around a Sheduhal, especially a Sheduhal who has been hunting in a particular community for some time, will be affected. They will be tired, they will be dull, they will sleep poorly, they will fall ill more easily. Their pets may sicken, their children may grow more slowly than expected. The inside life of an entire household, the scribe says, can be slowly drained by a single Sheduhal living among them. The household will not know what is happening. They will simply feel, generally, that they are not as well as they should be. The tablet says, and this is one of the most chilling sentences in the entire document, that the great majority of households where someone is mysteriously and chronically ill, where someone is wasting away for no apparent cause, where a family seems to be cursed with bad luck and weakness and early deaths, are households that have a Sheduhal somewhere in or near them. The Sheduhal does not need to be the one who is openly ill. The Sheduhal will in fact be the one who seems to be doing the best. The Sheduhal will be the one with the bright eyes and the steady appetite and the unusual energy. The others will be the ones who are fading. There is more. The tablet says that the Sheduhal, having lived on the earth for so long and having learned humans so deeply, have moved into positions of influence in human societies. They are not, generally, peasants. They are not, generally, the lowest ranks. They tend to position themselves among the powerful. They become merchants. They become priests. They become advisors to kings. They become, in the modern era, the people whose names we know and whose faces we see and whose decisions we live under. The scribe is careful here. The scribe does not name specific Sheduhal. The scribe does not say that any particular ruler of the scribe's own time is one of them, although the scribe implies that the scribe has suspicions. What the scribe says, in a passage that Lundstrom translated with particular caution, is that those who rule are often not what they appear to be. That the great houses of the world contain, in some numbers, members of the old hidden bloodline. That the long lifespans of certain noble families, the recurring features that pass down through generations of certain dynasties, the strange resemblances between rulers who lived centuries apart, are not always coincidences. The Sheduhal, in other words, are not just hiding among us as random individuals. They are, the tablet implies, integrated into the very structures of human power. They have been for thousands of years. They have shaped the development of human civilization from positions of quiet influence. They have perhaps even shaped which civilizations rose and which fell. They have, perhaps, decided which technologies humans would develop and which would be suppressed. They have, perhaps, written the histories that have come down to us, leaving themselves out of the record entirely. This is the sixth being, the Sheduhal, the quiet walking hidden ones. They came before the Lamukur. They survived the Lamukur. They are surviving us. They are still here. The tablet, after listing all six, comes to its final line. The line that the scribe addressed, across 4,000 years of time, to whoever might one day read the tablet. The line that Lundstrom translated last, and that he sat looking at for a long time before he finally wrote down what it meant. The line reads, in Lundstrom's translation, "You who read this, look around you. Among those nearest to you, count the ones whose eyes are too bright when they smile, and whose strength does not match their years, and whose families fade even as they themselves grow strong. These are the ones I am writing to warn you about. 5 of the 6 are gone, and you will not meet them. But the 6th has not gone anywhere. The 6th is still here. The 6th may even be reading this with you. The 6th may, in fact, be the one who handed you this tablet." That is the final line of the document. That is the line that ended Eric Lundstrom's translation. That is the line that, according to the records of the British Museum, caused Cabinet M to be locked in 1873 by George Smith and his colleagues, who had read enough of the tablet to understand what it was saying, and who had decided that what it was saying should not, under any circumstances, be made available to the general public. There is more to the tablet, although it is not part of the formal list of the 6. After the final line addressed to the reader, the scribe added what Lundstrom called the appendices. These are smaller sections, written in a slightly different hand, possibly added by a later scribe or possibly added by the original scribe at a later time. They expand on certain aspects of the Shadu that the main text only touched on. They are, in some ways, even more disturbing than the main text, because they go into detail about how the Shadu operate, and they make it difficult to read the rest of the tablet without applying it to the world around us. The first appendix discusses how the Shadu choose their hunting grounds. The scribe says that the Shadu prefer dense communities. They prefer cities. They prefer places where there are many people in close proximity, because the inside life is more concentrated in such places and the feeding is more efficient. In open country, in small villages, in places where people live spread out, the Shadu can survive, but they cannot thrive. They go where the food is, and the food is wherever humans gather in numbers. This means that throughout history, the great cities of the world have been the great hunting grounds of the Shadu, the early Sumerian cities, the cities of the Indus Valley, the cities of ancient Egypt, the great urban centers of every era. Wherever humans built density, the Shadu followed. They moved with civilization. They expanded with us. And in the modern era, with the enormous cities of millions of people that we have built, the hunting grounds of the Shadu are larger than they have ever been. The scribe gives a small detail that has stayed with every researcher who has read this section of the tablet. The scribe says that one of the markers of a city that has a significant Shadu population is a particular pattern of illness. The illness is not specific to any one disease. It is instead a general listlessness, a chronic fatigue, a wasting condition that affects many people in the city and that the local healers cannot explain or cure. The healers will try various remedies. The remedies will not work. The condition will spread through the city, generation after generation, without ever becoming a true epidemic, without ever being clearly identifiable as anything in particular. It will simply be there. People will be tired. People will be dull. People will die younger than they should, of nothing in particular. The Shadu are feeding. The city does not know. Anyone who has lived in a large modern city will, on reading this passage, find themselves thinking about certain patterns they have observed. The chronic exhaustion of city life. The way people in large urban centers seem to age more quickly than people in the countryside. The strange recurring conditions that the medical establishment cannot quite pin down, that get vague names and vaguer treatments. The fact that the wealthiest residents of the largest cities often seem to be somehow exceptions to these patterns. Their eyes are bright, their skin is good. They look younger than they should. They have, somehow, more energy than the rest of us. The scribe is not making a political point. The tablet was written long before any of our modern political categories existed. But the observation is hard to escape. The Shadu, the tablet says, position themselves among the powerful. They feed on the inside life of those around them. The result is that the powerful look healthier than they should, and the rest of the population looks worse than it should. And the relationship between these two facts is direct and causal. The second appendix discusses the ways in which the Shadu can be identified when they have grown careless, or when an observer is paying close attention. The scribe lists several signs. None of them, taken individually, is conclusive. A human can have any of these traits and still be entirely human. But the combination of several of them, the scribe says, should be taken seriously. The first sign is the eye contact. The Shadu, despite their long practice at being human, never fully mastered the human use of eye contact. They either hold contact too long, in a way that becomes unsettling and feels predatory, or they avoid contact altogether, in a way that feels evasive. A genuine human, the scribe says, moves their gaze fluidly, looking at a face for a moment, and then away, and then back, in a comfortable rhythm. The Shadu cannot quite manage this rhythm. They either lock on, or they will not look at all. The second sign is the smile. The Shadu, the scribe says, learned to smile, but they did not learn what a smile means. To them, a smile is a configuration of the face. It is something they put on. The result is that their smiles do not reach the eyes. The lower face moves into the smile shape. The upper face remains still. A human smile, the scribe says, involves the whole face. The corners of the eyes crinkle. The brow softens. The Shadu smile only with the mouth. The third sign is the touch. The Shadu, when they touch another being, are taking. They cannot help it. It is what they are. Their touch carries, even when they are not actively feeding, a small drawing sensation. A human who is touched by a Shadu will often, the scribe says, feel a brief moment of tiredness immediately afterward. They will not understand why. They will assume it is just the heat of the day, or the weight of the morning, or whatever else is convenient. But the touch took something from them, and they felt the taking even if they could not name it. The fourth sign is the question of pets. The scribe says that animals, especially dogs and certain kinds of cats, can detect Sheduhal in a way that humans cannot. Animals do not have the cultural conditioning that prevents humans from reacting to what they sense. An animal that meets a Sheduhal will, the scribe says, either growl and bare its teeth, or it will whimper and try to hide. The animal knows. The animal cannot speak, but it knows. And if you live with an animal that consistently reacts strangely to one particular person in your community, the scribe says, you should consider why. The fifth sign is the family pattern. A Sheduhal living among humans will, over time, leave a pattern. The people closest to them will fade. Their immediate family, their close friends, their employees, the pattern will not be uniform. It will not be obvious. Some of those close to the Sheduhal will be fine, perhaps because the Sheduhal chooses not to feed on them or feeds on them only lightly. Others will weaken and die. The deaths will appear unrelated. Different illnesses, different ages, different circumstances. But there will be more deaths around this person than would be expected by chance. There will be, the scribe says, a small dark cloud of misfortune that follows the Sheduhal through their life, and a careful observer who knew where to look could see the cloud. The third appendix is the longest and the most difficult to read. It addresses the question of what to do if you suspect that someone in your life is a Sheduhal. The scribe is, here, surprisingly cautious. The scribe does not recommend confrontation. The scribe does not recommend violence. The scribe says, in fact, that confronting a Sheduhal directly is almost always a mistake. They are old. They are patient. They are experienced. They have been dealing with humans who suspect them for thousands of years. They know what to say. They know how to disarm the accusation. They will, in almost every case, convince anyone watching that the accuser is the one who is crazy. And after the confrontation has been diffused, the Sheduhal will quietly begin to draw down the accuser's inside life until the accuser is dead. What the scribe recommends instead is something the scribe calls the slow withdrawal. The slow withdrawal is a strategy of gradually, quietly, without announcement, reducing your contact with the suspected Sheduhal. You do not announce that you are pulling away. You do not give any sign that you have noticed anything. You simply, over the course of weeks or months, see them a little less. You return their messages a little more slowly. You decline their invitations occasionally. You become, in a quiet and untraceable way, less available to them. The goal is to remove yourself from their feeding grounds without ever giving them a clear target to focus their attention on. The scribe says that this strategy works because the Sheduhal, despite their power, are not omniscient. They cannot track every human in the world. They focus their attention on the immediate environment around them. If you fade out of their environment slowly enough, they will redirect their attention to other prey, and you will be safe. They may even forget about you entirely. Their long lives have made them slow to remember individual humans. A human who has not crossed their path in a year may, to them, no longer exist. There is, the scribe says, one other strategy. It is harder. It is only for those who have the courage and the resources to attempt it. The scribe calls it the noticing. The noticing is simply paying attention. The Sheduhal, the scribe says, depend on not being seen. Their entire existence is built on remaining invisible. If you see them, if you really see them, with full attention and full understanding of what they are, something changes. The exact mechanism is not clear from the tablet. The scribe says only that being truly seen, being fully recognized, weakens them. They cannot feed as easily on someone who knows what they are. They cannot move as freely in a community where multiple people are aware of their presence. The light of true recognition is, in some way the scribe cannot fully explain, harmful to them. This is why, the scribe says, they spend so much effort to keep their existence a secret. This is why they have, over the course of human civilization, worked so hard to suppress every document that mentions them. This is why the tablet you are now reading was kept in Cabinet M for so many years, and why Lundstrom's translation was filed away and forgotten. The Sheduhal cannot risk being known. The act of being known is, to them, a kind of injury. The more people who know what they are, the harder their existence becomes. This brings us to a question that the tablet does not ask directly, but that hangs over the entire document. Why was the tablet allowed to survive at all? If the Sheduhal have been suppressing every mention of themselves for thousands of years, why is this particular tablet still in existence? Why did the scribe write it? Why was it preserved through the fall of Sumerian civilization, through the rise and fall of Babylon, through the long centuries of burial under the ruins of Nineveh, through its rediscovery by George Smith and its century in Cabinet M, through Lundstrom's translation and the photographs and the rediscovery of those photographs by Mira Ahlgren? Why has this one document survived when so many others, presumably, did not? The scribe gives a partial answer in the final lines of the third appendix. The scribe says that the tablet was made and preserved by a small group of humans who had discovered the truth about the Shedu-Hal, and who had decided that the truth needed to be passed forward, generation after generation, regardless of the risk. The scribe identifies the group only by a name that translates as the Watchers of the Watchers. They were a community of humans who had taken on the task of observing the Shedu-Hal, documenting them, and warning future generations about them. They worked in deep secrecy. They protected the tablet through generations of effort. They handed it down from one keeper to the next. And at some point, perhaps when the last of them died, or when they were finally found out and eliminated, the tablet was buried in the ruins of a temple where it would lie hidden until a future generation was ready to find it. George Smith, in 1873, found it. He recognized what it was. He hid it in Cabinet M. He may have understood himself, in his last years, as the new keeper of the tablet, as a continuation of the line of Watchers of the Watchers. He may have hoped to publish it eventually, when the time was right. He died in Aleppo before he could do so. Eric Lundstrom translated it. He may have understood himself as the next keeper. He too died before he could share what he had learned. The stroke that killed him was, the surviving records say, sudden and unexpected. He was a man in good health. There was no obvious reason for the stroke. The official explanation was a congenital weakness in his blood vessels. The unofficial explanation, which is whispered among the very few researchers who have read his translation, is that the Shedu-Hal noticed what he was doing, and that they removed him before he could publish. Mira Algren, the doctoral student who rediscovered the translation in 1998, distributed it carefully to the 3 researchers who verified its authenticity. She herself did not publish it. She did not give interviews. She did not put her name on any of the work that came out of her discovery. She continued her dissertation on a different topic and went on to a quiet academic career in a small university where she still teaches. She has, by all reports, refused every opportunity to talk publicly about the tablet. The most common interpretation among the researchers who have spoken with her is that she made a calculation. She believed she had been seen. She believed that the safest path forward was to step quietly away from the work and to let the 3 researchers, who had received the materials without knowing where they came from, decide what to do with what she had given them. The 3 researchers have themselves been cautious. They have shared the translation with a small number of trusted colleagues. They have allowed it to be discussed in private settings, at conferences, in the back rooms of academic gatherings. They have not, however, published. They have not held press conferences. They have not made any major public announcements. The tablet exists, in 2026, as a kind of open secret in certain narrow corners of the academic world. It is known to those who need to know. It is not known to the wider public. Until now. Because what you are watching is, in its way, a publication. A spreading of the information across a much wider audience than the tablet has ever reached before. The act of you watching this and listening to this, and the act of others doing the same, is itself an instance of the noticing that the scribe described 4,000 years ago. The light of recognition is being shown, however briefly, on a population that has lived in the dark for nearly all of recorded history. This may, or may not, make any difference. It is hard to say. The Shedu-Hal have survived many such moments before. They have survived the original Watchers of the Watchers. They have survived George Smith. They have survived Eric Lundstrom. They have survived every other small attempt over thousands of years to expose them. They are very good at outlasting their accusers. They are very good at making accusations look ridiculous. They are very good at fading back into invisibility when the attention dies down. But the scribe wrote what the scribe wrote. The tablet exists. The translation exists. The photographs exist. The information, having been brought into the light, cannot be fully returned to the dark. The first being is gone. The Agigisha folded themselves out of the world 1 billion years ago, and we have only the calibration of the atmosphere and the oceans to remember them by. The second being is buried below us. The Ushumgal dove down into the molten places when the deep ocean grew too warm for them, and they are, presumably, still there, in the hollow spaces beneath the crust, where we cannot reach them. The third being unmade itself. The Anzukin completed their record of the world and then chose to end, leaving their work in a place we cannot read, waiting for readers who have not yet come. The fourth being walked back into the sea. The Apkallu declined slowly over millions of years, and the last of them returned to the deep water, and the few who may survive there are no longer the civilization they once were. The fifth being is fading. The Lamukur, the great hairy giants of the high mountains, may have a few survivors in the most remote ranges, but they are old and solitary and on the edge of extinction. The sixth being is among us. The Sheduhal walk in our cities. They sit on our committees. They are in our houses, our offices, our governments. They have been hunting humans for as long as humans have existed. They have shaped our history in ways we cannot see. They are, the tablet tells us, still here. This is what the Sumerian tablet that lists 6 beings that were here before humans, and the one that is still here, actually contains. This is what was suppressed for a century. This is what Eric Lundstrom was reading when he died of a stroke he should not have had. This is what Mira Ahlgren held in her hands in the reading room of the Uppsala Library, and what she decided was too dangerous for her to publish under her own name. This is what the 3 researchers verified and then put away and rarely speak of even now. What you do with this information is up to you. The tablet does not give instructions for action. The tablet, in its final lines, simply asks you to look around, to count the ones whose eyes are too bright, and whose strength does not match their years, and whose families fade even as they themselves grow strong, to consider whether you know any such people, to consider whether any of them, sitting close to you in the rooms where you live and work, might not be what they appear to be. If you look, the scribe says, you may see. If you see, the seeing itself is a kind of protection. The Sheduhal cannot fully feed on those who have recognized what they are. The light of attention is a barrier they cannot easily cross. That is, perhaps, the entire purpose of the tablet. Not to incite a war, not to demand confrontation, not to call for any specific action against the 6th being, only to teach the next generation of humans how to see what their ancestors saw. To pass forward, across thousands of years, the simple knowledge that there is something walking among us, and that it has been here longer than we have, and that the only defense humans have ever had against it is the act of recognizing it for what it is. The Igigisha are gone, the Ushumgal are buried, the Anzukin are unmade, the Apkalusu are scattered, the Lamukur are nearly extinct, the Sheduhal are still here. Look around. There is one more section of the tablet that needs to be discussed before this account is complete. It is the smallest section, written along the lower edge of the reverse side, in a hand so small that Lundstrom had to use a magnifying glass to make it out. It is in some ways the most important part of the entire document, because this final section contains the historical record. The list of times when the Sheduhal have, throughout the long history of human civilization, been recognized and partially exposed, and the consequences of those exposures. The first incident the scribe records took place in the early Uruk period, roughly 3,500 years before the scribe was writing. It involved a priest of the temple of Inanna. The priest, whose name the scribe gives as Ur-Nammu-Shah, had noticed certain inconsistencies in the behavior of a senior advisor to the local ruler. He had observed the advisor for some months. He had compiled, in careful notes that he hid in his temple chambers, a list of small wrongnesses. The advisor did not eat the same way other people ate. The advisor did not sweat in the heat. The advisor's pets, dogs that he kept as a show of status, would not sleep in the same room with him. The advisor's young wife, a healthy girl from a noble family, had grown so pale and weak in the years since their marriage that she could no longer leave her bedchamber. Ur-Nammu-Shah came to the ruler. He presented his observations. He suggested in careful language that the advisor might not be what he appeared. The ruler listened. The ruler thanked the priest. The ruler dismissed him. 3 weeks later, Ur-Nammu-Shah was found dead in his temple chambers. The official cause was a sudden illness. His notes were never recovered. The advisor remained in his position. The young wife died a month later of the same wasting illness she had been suffering from. A new wife was found for the advisor. She too began to fade. The pattern continued for many years. The advisor served 3 different rulers, all of whom died younger than they should have. The advisor himself, the scribe says, was last seen in the city in the year of the scribe's own great-grandfather. He left without explanation. No one knows where he went. He has not been heard from since. The second incident took place in Egypt, during what the scribe calls the time of the long-built houses. This appears to refer to the era of pyramid construction. The Egyptian priests, the scribe says, had developed their own awareness of the Sheduhal. They called them by a different name, which the scribe transliterates but does not translate. The Egyptian priests had developed certain protective rituals. They had identified, over several generations of observation, a number of suspected Sheduhal in their own society. They had attempted to expose them. The result was a quiet purge, not of the Sheduhal, of the priests. The priests who had been documenting the Sheduhal began to die, one by one, of various causes. Their notes were destroyed, their temples were reorganized, the protective rituals were suppressed. By the end of a single generation, The knowledge that the Egyptian priests had accumulated about the Shidduhal had been almost entirely lost. Only fragments survived, in the form of certain images on tomb walls, certain prayers in certain papyri, certain references in texts that later scholars assumed were metaphorical. The third incident took place in Mesopotamia, again, more recently from the scribe's perspective, in the city of Lagash. A group of philosophers had begun meeting in secret. They had developed, over years of private discussion, a clear understanding of the Shidduhal and how they operated. They had identified, they believed, at least 3 Shidduhal living in Lagash at that time. They had begun to prepare a public document that would expose these 3. The document was never published. The philosophers were arrested by the city authorities on charges of conspiracy against the state. They were imprisoned. Their writings were burned. They were executed publicly in the city square. The 3 suspected Shidduhal remained in their positions of influence in Lagash. The scribe says, with what reads almost like resignation, that the suppression was so complete that even the names of the philosophers were forgotten within a generation. The scribe knows about them only because of an oral tradition that has been passed down within the scribe's own family for many generations, kept alive by ancestors who had been close to the events but had not participated in the exposure attempt. This is the pattern the scribe describes. Every attempt to expose the Shidduhal throughout the long history of human civilization has failed. Not because the exposures were inaccurate, some of them were quite accurate. The exposures failed because the Shidduhal had been in positions of power for so long and had so many resources and so much patience that they were able to suppress every attempt before it could spread. The scribe says that this is the central problem of the Shidduhal. They are not invincible, they are not invulnerable. They can be killed, they can be exposed, they can be defeated. But they cannot be defeated by any single individual or by any small group of individuals working in secret. The structure of their power is such that they can isolate, contain, and eliminate any focused attempt to expose them. The only way to defeat them, the scribe says, is through the spreading of the knowledge widely enough that they cannot contain it. Through the act of so many people knowing the truth, simultaneously, that no suppression effort can address them all. The scribe was attempting, with the tablet itself, to do exactly this. The scribe was trying to create a document that, if it survived, would carry the knowledge forward across enough centuries that it would eventually find a moment when the suppression mechanism was weak enough to allow widespread distribution. The scribe did not know when that moment would come. The scribe did not know whether it would come at all. The scribe simply prepared the document, encoded it in the densest cuneiform the scribe could write, and trusted that the watchers of the watchers would protect it until the right time arrived. We are perhaps that right time. The internet, the wide distribution of information across global networks, the simultaneous awareness of millions of people may finally be the circumstance the scribe was hoping for. A single video can reach more people, in a few weeks, than every document about the Shidduhal has reached in the past 4,000 years combined. The act of you watching this now, the act of other people watching this in their own homes around the world, is itself the realization of the scribe's long hope. This may, of course, fail. The Shidduhal have proven themselves capable of suppressing every previous attempt. They have, in the modern era, been involved with the entire structure of mass media. They have, almost certainly, anticipated and prepared for this exact moment. There will be efforts to debunk this video. There will be efforts to dismiss the tablet as a forgery. There will be efforts to discredit the researchers who have verified it. There will be efforts to make anyone who takes the tablet seriously look foolish and naive and conspiratorial. These efforts will be coordinated. They will be effective. Many people who watch this video will, by the end of the week, have decided that it was all nonsense. But not all. Some viewers will look around. Some viewers will notice things they had not noticed before. Some viewers will start to see patterns in their own lives that they had previously written off as coincidence. Some viewers will recognize in someone they know the signs the scribe described. They may not believe it fully, they may not act on it, but they will have seen. And the seeing is the entire point. The scribe asked for nothing more than that. The tablet does not call for a war on the Shidduhal. The tablet does not call for any specific action. The tablet only asks for awareness, for attention, for the human eye to be opened, even briefly, to what has been in front of it the whole time. If even one viewer of this video looks at someone in their life this week and thinks, for the first time, perhaps this person is not what they appear to be, then the scribe's work has succeeded. If even one viewer of this video begins to pay closer attention to the small wrongnesses that surround a certain charismatic, energetic, somehow always thriving individual in their community, Then a thread of light has been spun out into the dark. If even one viewer of this video begins to wonder why their pets react the way they do to a certain person, or why their own energy seems to drain after every interaction with a certain colleague, or why the people closest to a certain family member always seem to be the ones who get sick, then the 4,000 years of patient effort by the scribe and the watchers of the watchers has, at last, reached its intended audience. There is a final passage on the tablet that Lundstrom found particularly difficult to translate. It is a kind of prayer, or perhaps a meditation, that the scribe added after all the other content was complete. It does not address the reader directly. It addresses something else. The scribe was, in this final passage, speaking to whoever or whatever may have set the entire long sequence of beings in motion. The passage reads, roughly translated, as follows. To the one who placed the first walkers on this earth, whose name we never knew. To the one who waited for the arrival that did not come, and whose patience exhausted even the patient Igigi Shah. To the one whose seed was sown but did not grow as you intended. We who have come last. We who are made of the changing clay that the Apkallu Su shaped. We who carry in our hands the writing that began before our beginning, we ask you to remember us. We are the ones who came after. We are the ones who inherited a world that was not quite finished. We are the ones who walk among the survivors of the long line you began. We ask only to see clearly, to know what is around us, to recognize the shape of what is hidden. We ask, if you are listening at all, that you remove the veil from our eyes for long enough that we may protect ourselves. We do not ask for victory. We ask only for sight. This is the prayer of the scribe. It is the closing of the tablet. After this passage, the cuneiform ends. The remainder of the tablet's surface is blank. The scribe wrote what the scribe needed to write, and then stopped. What we know about the scribe, by name and by background, is very little. The tablet is not signed in any conventional way. The script is consistent with the late 3rd millennium, which would place it somewhere around 4,000 to 4,500 years ago. The dialect of Sumerian used is from the southern marshes, the area near Eridu and Uruk. The skill of the cuneiform is high, suggesting a trained scribe of considerable experience. Beyond this, we know nothing about who held the stylus. We do know, from the family history, that the scribe references obliquely in the tablet that the scribe's ancestors had been involved with the watchers of the watchers for some generations. The scribe was, in a sense, born into this work. The knowledge of the Sheduhal had been passed down to the scribe from parents who had themselves received it from their parents. The tablet was, perhaps, the culmination of many generations of careful observation and patient accumulation of information. What happened to the scribe after the tablet was completed is not known. The tablet itself was found in the ruins of a temple in Nineveh, which means it was at some point moved from the marsh cities where it was probably composed to the Assyrian capital, where it was buried in a temple library that was destroyed when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The journey of the tablet, from its place of origin to its final resting place under the rubble of Nineveh, is a story we do not know. The watchers of the watchers, presumably, moved it. They kept it safe. They handed it down. They placed it where they hoped it would survive until the right moment. The right moment, according to the tablet, has now arrived. Or it has not. It is difficult to say. Time will tell whether the spreading of the information through this video, and through other discussions of the tablet that are happening in various corners of the internet, will reach the threshold that the scribe was hoping for. It is possible that the suppression mechanism of the Sheduhal is still strong enough to contain this exposure, as it has contained every previous exposure. It is also possible that something has shifted, that the modern world has changed in ways the Sheduhal did not fully anticipate, that the information is now too widely distributed to be contained. We will see. Or we will not see. The Sheduhal will, presumably, continue to do what they have always done. They will continue to feed. They will continue to hide. They will continue to position themselves among the powerful. The 5 other beings will continue to be gone. The first will remain folded out of the world. The second will remain buried below. The third will remain unmade. The fourth will remain scattered in the deep waters. The fifth will continue to fade toward their final extinction in the high mountains. And the sixth will remain. The sixth has always remained. The sixth was here before any of us were born, and the sixth will be here long after we are dead, unless the slow, patient work of the watchers, continued at last by people like you, finally accomplishes what the scribe was hoping for, more than 4,000 years ago, when the stylus pressed into the wet clay for the first time and began to inscribe the names of the 6 beings that were here before humans, and the one that is still here. That is the tablet. That is what it says. That is what was hidden in Cabinet M for almost a century. That is what Eric Lundstrom translated before he died. That is what Mira Algren found in the Uppsala archive in 1998. That is what 3 independent researchers verified as authentic. That is what has now been brought, after all these years of suppression, into the light of public attention. What you do with this is up to you. You can dismiss it. You can call it a forgery. You can call it nonsense. You can decide that none of it could possibly be true. That is your right. The scribe expected, in fact, that many readers would respond this way. The scribe knew that the dismissal would be the first line of defense. Or you can look around. You can pay attention to the people in your life. You can notice the eyes that are too bright when they smile. You can notice the families that fade around certain individuals. You can notice the pets that growl at the wrong person. You can notice the strange chronic exhaustion that seems to follow you when you spend time with certain colleagues, certain friends, certain members of your own household. You can, in other words, accept the gift the scribe was trying to give. You can take what was kept hidden for 4,000 years and bring it forward into your own life. You can see. The seeing is the entire point. It always was. The scribe never asked for anything else. The Agigisha tended the world and folded themselves away. The Ushumgal ruled the deep oceans and went down into the stone. The Anzukin wrote the world and unmade themselves. The Epkalusu built the first civilization and returned to the sea. The Lamukur walked the high places and faded toward extinction. But the Sheduhal did none of these things. The Sheduhal did not leave. They did not finish. They did not fade. They learned to wear the faces of those around them, and they hunted, and they fed, and they made themselves comfortable in the structures of every civilization that humans built. They are still here. The tablet is, finally, a warning. It is the warning that was written into clay 4,000 years ago by a scribe whose name we will never know, on behalf of a tradition of watchers that lasted for generations, in the hope that one day enough humans would be ready to listen. Now you have listened. Now you know. What happens next is no longer in the hands of the scribe, or the watchers of the watchers, or Eric Lundstrom, or Mira Algren, or any of the other people who have carried this knowledge across the centuries. What happens next is in your hands. You have the information, you have the description, you have the signs the scribe taught you to look for. The rest is up to you. There is one further consideration that has occupied the small number of researchers who have read the tablet and who have given themselves permission to take it seriously. It is the question of the modern era. Specifically, it is the question of why the modern era looks the way it does, and whether the conditions of contemporary life can be understood, in any meaningful sense, as the result of Sheduhal influence operating across a much larger scale than the scribe could have imagined. The scribe wrote 4,000 years ago. The scribe was writing about cities of perhaps 50,000 people at the largest. The scribe described Sheduhal feeding patterns that operated at the scale of a household, a neighborhood, a small urban district. The scribe did not anticipate, and could not have anticipated, what cities would become. Today there are urban areas containing more than 20 million people in a single continuous settlement. There are countries with hundreds of millions of inhabitants. There are global networks of communication and finance that connect every part of the world into a single integrated system. The conditions of modern human life are utterly different from the conditions the scribe described. What would the Sheduhal do in a world like this? The scribe could not say, but the researchers who have thought about it have offered some speculations. The first speculation involves the patterns of modern illness. The scribe described how communities with significant Sheduhal populations would suffer from chronic low-grade fatigue, from vague wasting illnesses, from a general sense of being less well than people should be. In the modern era, we have something that looks remarkably like this, on a global scale. We have epidemics of chronic fatigue. We have epidemics of depression. We have epidemics of anxiety. We have epidemics of strange autoimmune conditions that the medical establishment cannot fully explain. We have, in general, a population that is by historical standards extremely safe, well-fed, sheltered, and protected from disease, but that is also somehow, on average, exhausted, tired, drained. The medical establishment offers explanations for all of this. Stress, screen time, diet, lack of exercise, social isolation, air pollution. There is no shortage of proposed causes. But none of them, taken individually, fully accounts for the scale of what is happening. People are tired in a way that they should not be. The standard explanations explain part of the pattern, but not all of it. There is, in the aggregate exhaustion of the modern world, a remainder that cannot be accounted for. The scribe would have an explanation. The scribe would point to the Sheduhal. The scribe would say that the population has grown enormously, that the cities have grown enormously, that the opportunities for feeding have multiplied, and that the Sheduhal have multiplied with them. The scribe would say that the bloodlines have spread, that the hybrids have integrated, that the proportion of the human population carrying some degree of Shedu-Hal ancestry has grown until the boundary between the predator and the prey is no longer clear. The scribe would say that we are, all of us, partially drained, all the time, because the feeding has become so universal that no one in the densely populated parts of the world is fully escaping it. This is, of course, only speculation. The tablet does not address modern conditions directly. The scribe lived in a different world and could not have imagined ours. But the framework the scribe provided does fit, with disturbing precision, onto the patterns we observe in our own time. The second speculation involves the question of power. The scribe noted that the Shedu-Hal positioned themselves among the powerful. In the small urban societies of ancient Mesopotamia, the powerful were the priests and the merchants and the advisors to the kings. In the modern world, the powerful are something different. They are the people who own controlling shares of multinational corporations. They are the people who hold senior positions in global financial institutions. They are the people who appear on the covers of magazines, whose names we recognize, whose faces we have seen so many times that we feel we know them personally, even though we have never met them. The scribe, looking at our world, would presumably ask the same questions the scribe asked about the powerful of the scribe's own time. Are their eyes too bright? Do they have unusual energy for their age? Do the people closest to them tend to fade? Do their pets react strangely? Do their immediate families show patterns of premature illness or death? Do the communities and the workers and the dependents who live in their shadow show the characteristic pattern of chronic low-grade exhaustion that the scribe identified as the mark of nearby Shedu-Hal feeding? These are questions that can be asked. They cannot necessarily be answered definitively. The information needed to answer them is, in many cases, not available to the public. But the questions themselves are not unreasonable. They are simply the questions the scribe was asking, applied to the powerful figures of our own time rather than to the priests and advisors of ancient Sumer. The third speculation involves the question of the breakdown of traditional community. One of the most observable features of the modern era is the dissolution of the kinds of dense, multi-generational, mutually supportive communities that characterized human life for almost all of recorded history. People today live in much larger numbers, alone. They live without extended family. They live without long-standing neighborhood ties. They live in apartment buildings full of strangers, in cities where they have moved for work, in a state of social isolation that would have been almost unimaginable to the scribe. The medical establishment has noted this. The breakdown of traditional community is widely understood to be a significant cause of the chronic mental health crisis that characterizes modern life. People need each other. People are not designed to live alone. The social isolation of the modern world is, by every measure, a major factor in human suffering today. But the scribe would, again, have a particular perspective on this. The scribe would note that humans living in tight, observant, mutually supportive communities are much harder to feed on than humans living alone. A close community notices when someone is fading. A close community pays attention to the energy of its members. A close community recognizes when a particular individual seems to be the source of patterns of decline in the people around them. The Shedu-Hal, in a tight traditional community, would have to operate carefully, in measured amounts, with constant attention to not being seen. But a population of isolated individuals, each living alone in their own apartment, each connected primarily through screens rather than through face-to-face relationships, each unaware of what is happening to the people around them, is a population that is much easier to feed on. There is no community to notice the patterns. There is no extended family to ask why a particular individual seems to be wasting away. There are only isolated victims, each one alone, each one disconnected from the others, each one explaining their exhaustion to themselves in private terms that prevent them from seeing the larger pattern. The scribe would say that the modern era, with its atomization of community and its isolation of the individual, is structurally favorable to the Shedu-Hal in a way that no previous era has been. Whether the Shedu-Hal have actually engineered this outcome, or whether they have merely benefited from it after the fact, is a question that cannot be answered from the tablet alone. But the conditions are what they are. We live in a world that, from the perspective of an ancient predator that feeds on the vital energy of isolated humans, looks like a buffet. This is the most disturbing version of the implications. It suggests that many of the features of modern life that we accept as inevitable, as the natural result of progress and urbanization and the development of the global economy, may not be inevitable at all. They may be shaped, in part or in whole, by the influence of beings who benefit from these conditions. The destruction of traditional community, the atomization of the individual, the replacement of face-to-face relationships with screen-mediated ones. The chronic low-grade exhaustion that characterizes the daily experience of most modern people, the brightening eyes and unusual vitality of the small population at the top of the global hierarchy. All of these patterns fit, with uncomfortable precision, into the framework that the scribe described 4,000 years ago. Whether you find this convincing is your own decision. You may find it absurd. You may find it interesting but unprovable. You may find it disturbing and useful. The tablet itself does not insist on belief. The tablet simply describes the 6 beings, the 5 who are gone and the 1 who remains, and asks the reader to look around. So look around. That is the only instruction the scribe gave. Look at the people closest to you. Look at the people in positions of power above you. Look at the patterns of vitality and decline in the communities you inhabit. Look at the chronic exhaustion that you yourself may be carrying. Look at your pets. Look at the eyes that are too bright when they smile. Look at the families that fade around certain individuals. If you see something, you have seen it. If you see nothing, you have looked. Either way, you have done what the scribe asked. The tablet has been opened. The names have been read. The 5 who are gone are remembered. The 1 who is still here has been described. What you carry forward from this is now yours. This has been the account of the Sumerian tablet that lists 6 beings that were here before humans, and the 1 that is still here. The tablet sits, according to the most recent information available to the researchers who track such things, in a private collection that was acquired from an unnamed estate sale in the early 2000s. The British Museum continues to deny that it ever existed. The translation by Eric Lundstrom continues to circulate quietly among a small number of specialists. The photographs continue to exist, both in the Lundstrom archive at Uppsala and in copies that Mira Algren distributed in 1998. The Shedu Hal continue to exist as well. They are, as the tablet says, still here. The question of whether you can see them, whether you will look for them, whether you will recognize them when they are near you, is the question the scribe left for the readers of the future. You are, at this moment, one of those readers. The scribe, 4,000 years dead, has finally reached you. Now you know what was on the tablet. Now you know the 6 names. Now you know what to look for. The rest, the scribe would say, is the work of your own life. May you walk in clear sight. May you recognize what is around you. May the long, quiet labor of the Watchers, carried forward across 4 millennia, finally find its harvest in the eyes of those who, having heard, choose to see.